Hello everybody, welcome back to another episode of Coding the Unknown, or a big one today that's going to get the comment section spicy because there's dumb people on the internet. Are vaccines really dangerous? Which could also be read as, are vaccines really dangerous? Like, are they dangerous or are they really dangerous? We won't be addressing that. We'll just be addressing whether they're actually dangerous at all. And I mean, yes, throughout history there have been vaccines that have been really dangerous. Wasn't Salk? Huh? Salk, the polio guy, didn't he test it on his own kids? Was that Salk? Jonas Salk? What was that guy's name? I don't know. Let's get into it. The format of the show, if you're new here, Kevin writes it, I read it. Let's go. People have been inoculating themselves against deadly disease for over 1,000 years, long before the invention of the first modern vaccine. As soon as modern vaccines were invented, so too was vaccine hesitancy. The idea that vaccines are unsafe has fluctuated in popularity over the centuries, and vaccine hesitancy appears to be reaching an all-time high. But is there any truth behind this? I don't know if it's reaching an all-time high. It definitely reached a higher point after the absolute cockface who is Andrew Wakefield. Really happy I'm getting his name right there. I mean, allegedly in my opinion. No, this guy's a cockface. Fucking sue me. He has a literal cock for a face. I mean, he doesn't. But he's responsible for so much horrible shit. He's the guy who published that study about vaccines causing autism, which was published in a big medical journal. I have a feeling it was the BMJ, but I'm not sure. And then it turns out that it was complete. But Andrew Wakefield got struck off the medical register, so he can't practice medicine anymore. I mean, that's got to suck, right? You go to medical school for a long time, you're kind of locked in on that career. And then they're like, yeah, no, you can't do that anymore. So he basically ended up leaning into this anti-vax stuff like hardcore. Absolute knob. Today's episode brought to you by the good people over at Vessi, long-time friends of the show, long-time sponsor. And I'm honestly a fan of Vessi's. Like Vessi, fan of sponsoring the show. I'm a fan of Vessi. What a beautiful circle of capitalism. Vessi's are great shoes. I've been wearing them pretty much exclusively for the last 3 years. I think there's been a couple of occasions where it's like, probably do need to wear smart shoes. Like, you know, you're wearing a suit and you're like, okay, I'm probably not going to wear trainers for this one. I did go to a funeral wearing my Vessi's because I forgot my shoes and it was fine. No one commented. I don't think that's because Vessi's look like they belong at a funeral. It's just my family are polite. Vessi's are perfect. They're made out of something called Dymatex, which is waterproof, also completely breathable. So you can wear these like big shoes in summer, and I have done that, and your feet are just completely fine. Somehow breathable, somehow waterproof. I would say it's magic, but it's not. It's a material called Dymatex. I've been wearing them. These are perfect in spring. I go out to my car in the morning. Garden's all ruined with builders, and there's puddles and wetness, but my socks always remain dry because of Vessi and their Stormburst and all of the other Vessis that I have, which you can find at vessi.com. And if you want to do me a favor, which go on then, please do, go to vessi.com/unknown for 15% off your first pair at checkout and start exploring without limits. There's also a QR code on the screen, so you can just click that and that'll set you up. Thank you very much, Vessi. Back to today's episode. Well, I decided to do my own research on the matter, and some of what I found was pretty surprising. To fully examine this topic, however, we're going to need to talk about what vaccines actually are. As many Americans genuinely don't know, their history over the years, potentially harmful chemicals used in vaccine production, dangerous vaccines that were taken off the market, and lies told to us about the COVID vaccine by the CDC. Once we've looked at all of the evidence, I'll leave it to you to decide how dangerous you think vaccines are and whether or not they should be mandatory. Let me just chime in at the beginning, and I'll give my opinion now, and then we'll see if my opinion has changed at the end, because I do like to go into these with an open mind. I definitely don't think vaccines, as a general rule, are dangerous. That's where I stand currently. I think, obviously, they've been extremely beneficial for society. I think there are certain vaccines which should not be mandatory. Chickenpox, perhaps. I've got both my kids vaccinated against chickenpox because it's just not covered by the government. You have to pay for it. But if you get chickenpox, you got to go off school for 3 weeks. And then if you get it yourself, it's just a nightmare. I don't want shingles or whatever adult chickenpox is. But I don't think they should be mandatory. All of them. I think some should be. I think we have to get that herd thing, like polio and shit. No one needs a polio vaccine anymore because we got rid of it. But if it came back, I'd be like, yeah, make it mandatory, of course. I don't want, people to be in iron lungs and shit. It's 2025. Get them stuck. And people will be like, oh, it's my body. But generally, these are the same people who are like, pro-life. Making mind up. 1,000 years of inoculations. Modern medical science is really new. Although the idea had been proposed at various times, going back as far as ancient Greece, germ theory didn't become widely accepted until the end of 1800. Bacteria were discovered in the mid-1600s using primitive microscopes, but a causal relationship between bacteria and disease wasn't fully established until the 1880s. Viruses were then discovered in the 1890s, and these discoveries issued in the age of modern medicine. However, medicine and medical treatment still existed before that. A lot of it was based on mysticism and nonsense, but that doesn't mean that none of it worked. It just means the people practicing medicine had incorrect beliefs about why it worked, and in many cases, they might have no idea why it worked at all. And in many cases, it just didn't work at all, like we were sticking leeches on our bodies for a long-ass time. For example, the tree Salvadora persica is known as the toothbrush tree. People across Africa, the Middle East, and India have been using branches from this tree as a form of toothbrush for over 1,000 years because the bark contains antifungal and antimicrobial agents. They obviously had no idea that this was the case. All they knew was that of all the branches they could use for oral hygiene, these ones seemed to give them the best results. Wait, sticks? Wait, so already they were just... What they chose to brush their teeth with was a selection of different sticks? Surely there's something that can use, I don't know, like moss or something. I remember you go camping and you got like burned pans. You can always just rub them on moss and it does a great job of removing the burn. Couldn't we like just rub our teeth on moss? I'm just really happy I have a fucking electric toothbrush. You see, if there's one thing that humans have always been good at, it's recognizing patterns. Even if we don't understand the exact mechanisms involved in what's happening, we can still identify patterns whenever they emerge. The downside of that is that humans are also really good at finding patterns where they don't exist. But that's not important right now, but it will become very important, Kevin. Think about how easy it is for you to see objects in clouds. Like, we're insanely good at pattern spotting and just making it up. Like, we're like ChatGPT, we'll just hallucinate patterns. What matters is that it didn't take long for people to notice that once a person had contracted a deadly disease and survived, they almost invariably would never get sick with that same illness again. This meant that if you could give somebody a disease early in life, it should grant them lifelong immunity. Thanks to this observation, people developed a form of inoculation known as variolation. Basically, variolation was just intentionally infecting somebody with a disease, usually smallpox, as that seems to be the primary disease people were inoculating against, and then if they survived, they would never have to worry about it again. Wait, aren't diseases typically more dangerous if you're a child? Like, my kids get all sorts of diseases, and I'm like, oh god, I'm definitely going to get that. And then you just don't, because you've got like a killer adult immune system. And they don't. Admittedly, on the surface, that does not sound so great. Deliberately giving me smallpox now so that I don't have to worry about smallpox later might be great for future, Kevin, but if those were my options, I think I'd prefer to just roll the dice and try to avoid being infected at all. Yes, definitely, because it's like, oh, okay, well, I'll be immune later. But it's like, well, yes, but couldn't I just get it later and then get immune later and not risk dying today? Fortunately, variolation was a bit more sophisticated than that. Beginning in the 9th or 10th century in China, smallpox scabs from an infected person would be dried and blown up a person's nose. Having another person's bloody scabs blown up my nose might sound disgusting and unpleasant, and I'd really rather not, but the infections produced by this method resulted in much milder symptoms than a full-blown case of smallpox. And despite the infections being less severe, the immunity was no less complete. Didn't they eventually discover... Sure, Kim is going to get to this. I just want to show how big brain I am. Didn't they start doing it with cowpox? Like, they realized cows had a disease similar to smallpox, so they tried giving that to people, and it wasn't very severe, but it made them immune to smallpox as well. Although we can say for certain that inoculation against smallpox dates back 1,000 years, there is evidence to suggest that it had been taking place since around 200 BC. Humans may not have understood how viruses and the human body worked, but they still recognized the existence of natural immunity and sought ways to grant that immunity to people in the safest ways possible with their limited knowledge. Methods for variolation of smallpox became slightly less gross as well. Yeah, the blowing the scabs up the nose is like, you got scabs, other people's scabs in your lungs. Although only slightly. Within a couple of hundred years, instead of using dried scabs, doctors instead would stab a smallpox person's blisters with a needle and extract the pus, then scratch a person with the needle to infect them with the pus. This again resulted in a less severe form of the infection, but still granted full immunity. This is definitely something I'd do. Like, I know it's risky, but if smallpox is a massive issue and everyone's getting smallpox and all of this, I'll just be like, yeah, I'll roll the dice on the less infectious one, knowing that I'm pretty much going to get smallpox at some point. Maybe I'll just live in a bubble. Maybe I'll just never leave the house. I feel like I'd get it anyway. Like I'd have to go outside for some emergency, and that one time I go outside, I'd get smallpox from like the postman or something. Obviously, these methods were not without risk. The mortality rate for smallpox inoculations was about 2%, but that was still far lower than the 30% mortality rate for people who contracted the disease in the wild. It was, yeah, I would roll that dice so hard every day. I mean, I'd just do it once, but 30% compared to 2%? I mean, take the scab blowing or whatever they're doing. It was far from a perfect system, but it was very clear that inoculating people against smallpox was safer than not doing so. The pus form of variolation against smallpox may have originated in India, but it became widespread across Europe. It was widely accepted, and by the 1700s, most Europeans were immune to smallpox, either from inoculation or from getting the disease naturally. In the New World, however, this had not been taking place. There weren't a lot of large cities in America, and most people were fairly rural. Since everybody was so spread out, the American colonies never had a widespread outbreak that resulted in herd immunity. Instead, there were a number of smaller, isolated outbreaks, each of which caused a great panic. One of those occurred in Boston in 1775, shortly after the Battle of Bunker Hill. Ah yes, the Battle of Bunker Hill. So familiar with... It's like one of those things where Kevin, who is American, is like, the Battle of Bunker Hill, yes. And I'm just like, the Battle of what? Smallpox began ravaging the citizens of Boston, and to some extent, the British troops led by General William Howe. George Washington hadn't been at the Battle of Bunker Hill, but he arrived shortly after to take over as the colonists' commander-in-chief. Washington protected his troops by forbidding them to enter Boston during the outbreak, but this was only a short-term solution. Over the coming year, smallpox outbreaks again began hitting the colonial troops. Not only did this have an immediate impact on their ability to fight, but it was killing recruitment. As much as the colonists wanted their freedom from the British, many of them explicitly refused to enlist because of their fear of contracting smallpox. I mean, hell yeah, look, I'm just saying how I wanted to stay in my house and not get smallpox. And they're like, oh no, you gotta go to a place where there's a bunch of dudes doing like war I mean, they're probably like rubbing each other's faces with war paint. I don't know what they're up to. But it's going to be a close quarters environment, isn't it? It's a smallpox festival, basically. By 1777, George Washington was left with only one choice. He issued the first medical mandate in U.S. history. All members of the Continental military were required to be inoculated against smallpox. Washington wrote in his order, "Necessity not only authorizes but seems to require the measure. For should the disorder infect the army in the natural way and rage with its usual virulence, we should have more to dread from it than from the sword of the enemy." The decision is credited as being a major factor in the eventual victory and independence of the United States. Try telling that to the anti-vax people today. It's like, yo, dude, you got a country because of this shit. They'll be like, I don't think that's how it works, Simon. Though obviously there were a whole lot of other things that played into that as well. Regardless, Washington's assessment was almost certainly correct. Mandated inoculations may not have been directly responsible for the Continental military's victory, but without said inoculations, they almost certainly would have had to face defeat. It sure was a scary few weeks, though, as they had to ensure the British didn't find out that the army was in a heavily weakened state while everybody recovered from the inoculations. Why didn't they just do it in phases? If everyone's being ravaged by smallpox before, just be like, okay, we'll do 10% this week, and then 10% in 3 weeks, another 10%, 6 weeks. Stagger it, Washington. I'm sure that Washington's a smart dude. I'm pretty sure there was a reason. But it just seems quite obvious. At this point, you might be thinking, I mean, that's a fascinating history lesson, Kevin, but what does this have to do with vaccines? And to that, I'd say, chill, we're about to get there. This is still important, though, as variolation and people's ability to recognize patterns led to what happened just 2 decades later, the invention of the first modern vaccine. This is the cowpox thing, because I just read Edward Jenner. In 1796, British physician. I'm like... wait, why is a physicist handling this? And then I realized a physician is a doctor. Edward Jenner made an incredible discovery. The person who contracted cowpox would become immune not only to future cases of cowpox, but to smallpox as well. By the way, this is something like me saying there that I'm like, oh yeah, British physician. I'm like, wait, why is a physicist working on this? I will 100%, maybe not now, but have people on Twitter being like, how can he talk about vaccines and knowledge of vaccines when he doesn't know the difference between a physician and a physicist? It's like, oh my god, dude, that's what you've hung on to? That's what you'll hang your hat on? You douchebag? A person who contracted cowpox would become immune not only to future cases of cowpox, but to smallpox as well. Well, he wasn't actually the first person to notice this, and there are a couple of cases of other physicians using cowpox passed to inoculate against smallpox, but that was all anecdotal. Jenner was the first person to experimentally prove that cowpox could be used to vaccinate against smallpox. Jenner obtained cowpox pus from a milkmaid, and he used that to inoculate an 8-year-old boy. After the boy's infection cleared, Jenner then tried to infect the boy with smallpox. Mentioned in the past. Hey boy, where are your parents? I don't know, sir. Oh, he's British, isn't he? I don't know, sir. Maybe they're at the mines. Come over here. Nothing happened, so the test was repeated. Again, more smallpox. Give him more. Again, the boy had no effects from smallpox being introduced into his body. Jenner repeated this test with a number of other patients as well, but nobody who was vaccinated using the cowpox virus ever got infected or showed a reaction to later exposure to smallpox. The word vaccine even comes from variolae vaccina. Oh god, Latin. Variolae vaccinae, Jenner's term to describe cowpox. This was a huge development, as cowpox was far less severe than smallpox. The method of inoculation was effectively the same as they'd been doing for a millennium, but by using a weaker virus, it became much safer. There had also been the very real possibility that smallpox inoculations could result in outbreaks as a person who is potentially contagious while being inoculated. The vaccine took away that fear, though it created another. As it turns out, vaccine hesitancy is as old as vaccine, and a lot of people didn't want to be inoculated in this way. It had been proven to be effective and safer than smallpox variolation, which was safer than actually getting smallpox, so what could people possibly be afraid of, you ask? Go ahead, Simon, make your most ludicrous guess. Alright, it's got something to do with Jesus. That would be my most ludicrous guess. That there's some religious thing holding people back from getting vaccinated against a horrible disease that will either kill them or make them horribly deformed for the rest of their days. I feel like that's a Jesus thing. I guarantee you nothing you guess will be as close to insane as the real reason. Alright, it was dinosaur Jesus. Because the smallpox vaccine contained the cowpox virus, people were afraid that it would turn them into cows. Oh, it's not as insane as Jesus, dinosaur Jesus, Kevin, but the fact that that's the real thing is absurd. I shit you not, this is a real thing that happens. Here's a political... People are getting smallpox. They're afraid. Oh no, it's not going to kill me and make me horribly scarred. It's going to make me tiny. Here's a political cartoon from 1802 featuring Jenner giving people the smallpox vaccine, only for them to sprout horns or have cow heads randomly popping out from various places on their body. Look, if you're listening to this as a podcast, it's just an insane picture of people. Like, that dude seems to have, like, a pig's head growing out of his arm. It's like, you know, whoever painted this just took too much LSD one day and did not have a good trip. I can understand why people might have fears over smallpox inoculations, as some people incorrectly believed that it was deadlier than contracting the disease naturally. However, the idea that, oh my god, it's just like, what, 200 years ago? It's the same shit today. However, the idea that people would be horribly disfigured by vaccinating using cowpox doesn't make any logical sense. And just before people pipe up about COVID or whatever, COVID is not what's entering my mind here. I'm talking about vaccines that have been used for decades, perhaps centuries, and, you know, because COVID was a very recent thing. We're still, like, lots of data to analyze, lots of long-term effects to be studied. I'm talking about, you know, like childhood vaccines, you know, tuberculosis, chickenpox that my kids just had, that kind of stuff. In the olden times, although COVID vaccines, yes, I vaccinated, like, until they stopped vaccinating people. I was down with that. I wanted to go the fuck outside. In the olden times, there were no class of people considered more than milkmaids. Alright, milkmaids were considered so incredibly attractive because they could contract cowpox and thus not get infected with smallpox. I'd be a milkmaid. I'd be a milkman. Oh wait, that's a real thing. Wait, is a woman who delivers milk, I know that's not a thing anymore, is she a milkwoman or a milkmaid? Because we used to have, when I was a kid, the milkman, and he would come on this electric milk float, is what we called it. It's memories from my childhood, and he'd drop off little glass pints of milk. I feel like that's the sort of I'm going to talk about in like 30 years when I'm old. I mean, I'm old already, but like when I'm nearly 70, and people will be like, oh my God, Dad. I mean, my kids. They'll be like, you lived in the past. You had no, like, internet, and the milkman dropped off bottles of milk in glass bottles? Cowpox only caused blisters on the arms and hands, and these usually didn't scar. As a result, milkmaids were renowned for their smooth, clear skin. Smallpox, on the other hand, left the faces and bodies of its victims so deeply scarred that it had been jealous of Edward James Olmo's comparatively flawless skin. Who the fuck is Edward James Olmo? I don't know who that is. But I assume he's a dude who has, like, acne scars or whatever. Just imagine those. Just imagine the worst acne scars you've ever seen, and then just be like, everyone, much worse with smallpox. Fortunately, you've seen pictures. I'm sure you've seen pictures. Fortunately, world governments didn't really care about these unfounded concerns. Beginning in the 1840s, smallpox vaccination was even required to travel, but the vaccine needed to be stored at low temperatures, so in other parts of the world where refrigeration wasn't as available, it was harder to vaccinate large populations against the disease. It wasn't until the 1950s, when a new method of manufacturing the vaccine was developed, that it was able to be effectively shipped all over the world. And once that was possible, the entire world banded together to put an end to this disease once and for all. That is a sentence which so often in these videos is followed up by, no, not really, just joking. What we did is we killed each other some more. The fact that this actually happened like this is dope. Smallpox is one of the oldest known diseases, killing countless people over the past 10,000 plus years. Even though inoculation was common throughout much of the world when Jenner created the vaccine, smallpox still killed around 10% of the world's population, 20% in higher density areas. That's nuts, dude. We just demolished that shit. In the 1900s alone, over 300 million people died of smallpox. Jesus Christ. And just remember, I know the population of the world is 8 billion or whatever today, and 300 million of that is still a lot. But back in the 1900s, even like towards the end of that century, wasn't it like 6 billion? It was way less people. But all of that death finally came to an end in 1980 when the World Health Organization officially declared smallpox eradicated and with no chance of returning. It was the first disease for which a vaccine was ever created, and thanks to a concerted worldwide effort, it became the first and currently only disease that humans have completely eradicated. Except it's kept in labs, right? The CDC in Atlanta has one. I think there's a Russian lab that also has one, and they basically use it to make more advanced vaccines against it in case, like, someone weaponizes it, right? Like, let's say a terrorist gets control of smallpox and, like, weaponizes it, somehow makes it more deadly. The government wants to have vaccines ready to go against that kind of shit. As far as is that right? I'm talking out my arse here, but I think that's the reason they have those smallpox samples still kept in. I'm sure they're like in like super P4 biolabs or whatever, but it's not entirely eradicated. Unless they've destroyed it. Maybe they've destroyed it. Oh, I feel like I've heard about that. And it's like, yeah, the Americans be like, we destroyed it. The Russians be like, yes, so did we. And it's like, neither of them destroyed it. Of course they didn't. If nothing else, this history lesson should show that vaccines can be extremely effective at protecting people. Admittedly, though, smallpox was an easy target. The virus that caused smallpox was really large by virus standards, and as such was really stable with few mutations and variants. It wasn't the constantly moving target that other viruses like the flu are, so eradication was a lot easier. Still, the fact that, in all likelihood, none of you watching this video have ever known anybody who contracted smallpox should be proof the vaccines are absolutely effective. Before we talk more about recent vaccines and the fears related to them, however, there is something else we need to address. I feel this is people in seatbelts as well. Like, the people who don't get vaccinated and people who don't wear seatbelts kind of in the same camp for me. Because, like, if you ask my parents, who are in their 60s, like, do you know someone who's died in a car accident? They'll be like, yes, absolutely. Several. And they're almost always back in the day. Whereas today, do I know anyone who's died in a car accident? I know of people. Like, I know there was a kid who I went to school with who died in a car accident, but that was like a decade after I left school. I don't even remember the kid's face, but I just remember the vague name of him. And he died in a car accident. But because car safety and seatbelts got awesome, and people just don't really die in car accidents that much anymore. Ergo, safety features like seatbelts, really useful. Put your seatbelt on.
Fasten your seatbelt.
Sorry, rant over. Chances are that a lot of you watching this still had no idea that the smallpox vaccine was just pus from cowpox blisters. I'm not afraid to admit that I didn't know that either before researching that script. Oh, I did know that. I don't know if it's because Edward Jenner's British, but it was definitely covered on the biology curriculum when I was a kid. Edward Jenner and cowpox and smallpox. As it turns out, though, a lot of people have no idea what vaccines actually are. So before we go any further, I should explain the different types of vaccines and how they work. Or if they work at all, Kevin. Types of vaccines and how they work. In researching this episode, there was one comment I saw reposted numerous times by those opposed to vaccines. It was far from ubiquitous, but I saw the question asked frequently enough and with not enough pushback to make it clear that a whole lot of people have genuinely no idea how vaccines work. All right, I'm going to take my best crack at it and possibly embarrass myself. There's a few different ways. There's like live vaccines. There's dead vaccines. I think, are they called denatured? Is that? There's a word for it, right? Or deactivated, something like that. And then, so it's like a weak version of the virus. Or a dead version of the virus, but enough for your immune system to remember it. So they inject you or expose you to this weak version of the virus. Your body, being a boss, handles it, and then it's like, oh, okay, now I know how to kill that virus. And then the next time you're out in the wild or whatever, and that full-on big boy virus with all of its full strength comes along and is like, hello, body, let's tango. Your body's like, oh no, I killed your brother, your weak little brother, and I remember his weak spots. And then your body's immune system just takes care of the big boy virus because it knows how to fight it. Like, it's learned how to fight based on a weaker opponent. Let's see. I kind of think that's how it works. That comment was some variation of, instead of dangerous vaccines, why can't we just use a dead version of the virus so people can develop a natural immunity to it? I believe that's what many vaccines are. They're not always a weakened version. Sometimes they are indeed a dead version. Most of you, including Simon, are already aware that that's exactly what we do. At least, it's one of the things we do because there are a few different types of vaccines. All of them work in fundamentally the same way, though. When your body encounters a foreign pathogen, it wants to eliminate two things happens. First, your body creates B cells and T cells to fight off the infection. B cells produce antibodies specifically designed to fight off that particular foreign entity, and T cells destroy any of the body's own cells that have been infected by the virus. That's how you fight off an infection. All right, so just to put that in simple terms, virus enters your body, one type of cell is working at killing it, and then another one is working on getting rid of all the virus, and then another one's working killing all of the cells in your body that have been infected by the virus. So like a war on two fronts. Once that's done, a number of the B and T cells turn into memory cells. These are cells that remember what the foreign invader was, so if it ever appears again, your body can quickly fight it off without having to develop new defenses from scratch. I know vaccines are cool and all of that, like really good, but the body is dope, dude. Like the fact that it can just remember this it's just crazy.
Amazing!
This is what grants people with lasting immunity against diseases, and typically this immunity will last forever. Your results may start to vary once you get to 75 or 80 years old, but in general, the immunity is permanent. There is another caveat to that as well, but we'll get to that when I discuss how the CDC lied to us. Anyway, that's what your body does when you get sick to fight off the infection and prevent future infection. The earliest vaccines, such as the smallpox vaccine, were what are known as live attenuated vaccines. Okay, so not denatured, attenuated was the word I was looking for. These vaccines contain a weakened version of the virus that wouldn't make the patient as sick, or maybe not sick at all, but that would elicit a strong immune response. There were a couple of benefits of using live attenuated vaccines. To start, they were the easiest to develop early on, and because it was a live virus that could infect the person and replicate, the body's immune response was strong enough that a single vaccine dose would usually be enough to guarantee full immunity. Yeah, but then you got to go through I don't feel so good. I remember when I got that first COVID jab, I was like, whoa, I feel horror. I remember I had dinner plans that evening and I was like, whoa, there's no way I could possibly go out for dinner. I'm just like, I go to my office because I feel fine. And then I'm in the office just lying on my couch, wrapped up in a blanket and shivering. I cancel my dinner plans. And then 4 o'clock rolls around. It's 6 hours and I'm like, whoa, I'm completely fine now. It was weird. It was just immediately getting over a flu in 20 minutes. However, being live viruses was also one of the weaknesses of these vaccines. Not only could live vaccines be dangerous to a person who is immunocompromised, some also carried the risk of making the person contagious. And by some, I mean just 3: polio, rotavirus, and smallpox. In the first two, the virus would be shed in feces, and with smallpox, it was shed via scabs, so contagion wasn't a serious risk of these vaccines. It was just technically possible. So don't go smearing your over your friends or blowing your scabs up their nose. Next, there are inactivated viruses. These are effectively dead viruses, but they're still unwanted foreign entities and the body reacts the same way. However, because the viruses are dead and unable to replicate, the reaction isn't as strong. As a result, these vaccines often require multiple doses before a person will have full immunity to the disease. For example, hepatitis A requires 2 shots and polio required 4. I know I just mentioned polio as a live vaccine, but there were 2 different vaccines for it. There are also recombinant vaccines. If you've ever heard of a vaccine using virus-like particles, this is the type of vaccine that we're talking about. I'm not familiar with this. Viruses have a hard outer shell made of protein. Along that shell are protrusions referred to as spike proteins. These spikes are what the virus uses to attach to and invade the cells in our body. So instead of injecting a person with a bunch of dead viruses, what if we just injected them with a bunch of spike proteins from that virus instead? At first I'll be like, that's not going to work, but I'm not a scientist. If that does work, that's great. The immune system will still be able to identify and kill the thing that it needs to, and there's not really anything that can go wrong because the patient isn't even being exposed to the actual virus, dead or alive. Well, that sounds awesome. Why are we using that for all of them? This means this type of vaccine is safe for a person regardless of how immunocompromised they might be. Because only the spike proteins are being introduced into the patient instead of whole virus cells, it means a single injection can have a lot more individual things in it. That creates a stronger response, though some vaccines using this method still do require 2 doses to provide immunity. If that's the one that's available, I want that one. That just seems like it's going to give the best results with the lowest risk of, infecting other people or having a bad reaction. Right? But perhaps the 2 most unique types of vaccines are toxoid vaccines. These vaccines only work for bacterial infections, not viral, because they work in a completely different way. I was vaguely aware there were bacterial vaccines, but I don't really know anything about them. Rather than training the immune system to battle the germs themselves, toxoid vaccines target the toxins created by specific bacteria. The vaccine contains an inactivated version of the toxin, so the body can learn to fight that off and thus protect against any damage the bacteria would do to our systems. Again, though, these are only useful for bacterial infections like tetanus and diphtheria. Oh yeah, of course, tetanus. Tetanus is a bacteria. I did know this, and of course I've had tetanus jabs. And of course, that brings us to the final and most controversial type of vaccine, mRNA vaccines. These have been in development for decades, but there were no mRNA vaccines approved for human use before the COVID pandemic. These vaccines are intended to work in the same way as a recombinant vaccine, teaching the body to target the spike proteins of specific viruses. However, instead of injecting a person with the proteins, they are instead injected with strands of mRNA that enter into the cytoplasm of a cell. That's great, but the obvious question here is what the hell does any of that mean? So, each of your cells has a nucleus containing DNA. The nucleus will produce strands of messenger RNA, or mRNA, that are sent off to the cell's cytoplasm. Each of these strands contains a portion of the DNA instructions, and they are used to tell the cytoplasm what kind of proteins to produce. So basically, your cytoplasm is a factory, and the strands of mRNA from the cell's nucleus are its work orders. Okay, so mRNA is like telling DNA what to do. When the vaccine enters the cytoplasm, the mRNA inside the vaccine utilizes the body's pre-existing machinery to produce the virus proteins that we want to create immunity to. Oh, wow. I just realized I don't know how this works. Like, I know I heard a lot about mRNA, but I never really looked into it because I'm not a scientist. And you got a choice, right? You either trust the scientists or you trust the skeptics. And generally, I'm a skeptical person, so naturally, I'd go towards skepticism. But, when the overwhelming scientific majority says something, I'm just like, okay, cool, I'm down. Stab me up.
Hell yeah, I'm game.
And people be, Simon, you're an idiot, do your own research. And it's like, I just don't have the intellectual capacity, and honestly, neither do you, probably, to figure something like this out on your own from your entirely own research. And if you do, you're probably a scientist, and you probably figured out that you should have a vaccine. Anyway, people are going to hate this episode. There's going to be that small group of people who are really going to hate what I'm saying. And it's just, I don't know, man. I like science. I don't know. Just follow the science. So in our factory analogy, you can think of the vaccine as basically a special order for rush delivery. The cell will begin producing the virus proteins, and within 24 to 72 hours, the mRNA from the vaccine will break down into its component enzymes, as mRNA is really fragile. And of course, once the proteins are created, the body learns to fight them the same way it would fight a recombinant vaccine. While they've only been used one time so far, mRNA vaccines have one huge advantage over other vaccines. They are incredibly fast to produce. Because no part of the actual virus is used in the manufacturing of these viruses, we don't have to culture cells to use them. Culturing cells is the biggest bottleneck in the production of vaccines, and this completely eliminates that. Now, I'm going to address all of the popular concerns about vaccines shortly, but there is one specific concern related to mRNA vaccines that I want to discuss while we're still going over the science of all of this. These vaccines are not gene editing or gene therapy. This was a popular claim being made when the vaccines were rolled out, but this isn't the case. To start, the strands of mRNA only have the information on them for a single thing: make the virus protein the body needs to learn to kill. More importantly, however, they have no way to enter the cell nucleus. The nuclear membrane does have pores through which it can eject mRNA out into the cytoplasm to make proteins, but those doors are one-way only. The membrane is very selective about what is allowed inside, and once mRNA has left the nucleus, it has no business coming back. There is also nothing in the vaccine that would allow the mRNA to permeate this barrier. Even if it did somehow enter the nucleus, which should be impossible, it's not like it can do anything. It's just a set of instructions to make protein. It cannot rewrite your DNA. And even if it did, your DNA has built-in error correction capabilities. DNA mutates all the time when your cells replicate, so there needs to be a way to fix those mutations. And if the mutations are too much to fix, the cell will just self-destruct. This happens in your body on a daily basis. Anyway, that covers the history and science behind vaccines, so hopefully we're all on the same page at this point. We should all be on the same page with how vaccines were conceived and developed, how they work, and how effective they can be when the world works together, and the virus doesn't keep mutating like a little asshole. Okay, yeah, logically, we should all be on the same page. I don't think there's anything weird or controversial said so far. And for a while, everybody really was on the same page. Sure, when vaccines were a brand new technology, there were people out there thinking they'd turn them into cows. But for the next 150 years or so, people accepted that these were good things that saved lives. The first major turning point didn't come until the 1950s, when people suddenly became terrifyingly aware of the potential negative side effects of vaccines. Vaccine-associated paralytic poliomyelitis, and hopefully not you. Although smallpox was not officially eliminated worldwide until 1980, vaccine mandates had eliminated it from the Western world before that. As a result, the new most feared disease became polio, and with good cause. The mortality rate for polio was 2 to 5% in children and 15 to 30% in adolescents and adults. Shit, okay, so I kind of thought we got stronger as we got older, but the talk about giving people the disease when they were younger kind of makes sense now. That's true. Like, if you get smallpox as an adult, it's worse, isn't it? Is it shingles? Is that the adult version of smallpox? Am I right about that? Is that true? But it's worse than smallpox. And unlike smallpox, it's possible you may have actually seen the effects of polio firsthand. No, never have seen the effects of polio firsthand. I know about it. There's people who are recently alive. or are still alive, who've had polio. There was that guy who lived in that iron lung who recently died. The father of one of my high school friends had polio, and the damage it can do is very visible. One of his legs was only 5 inches in circumference, and he needed to wear a leg brace his entire life. If you're unaware exactly how this disease works, polio is a paralytic disease that impacts the nervous system, resulting in weakness and paralysis, usually of the legs. In severe cases, the paralysis will impact the muscles required for breathing, which is usually how polio becomes fatal. The iron lung was developed as a way to help polio patients breathe until their bodies, hopefully, were able to fight off the infection. Each year, it was estimated that 500,000 people died worldwide from polio. Because it was so widespread, potentially fatal, and caused permanent disability, a vaccine for polio became a top priority for many scientists. Among them was American physician Jonas Salk. There he is, it was Salk. Is that what I said? Salk was the first to develop a polio vaccine, which was tested on 1.6 million children in the US, Canada, and for some reason Finland. I would have thought that having part of the trial take place in Europe would add a lot of unnecessary cost and complexity, but I'm sure there was good reason for it. Regardless, the trials began in 1953, and in April of 1955, the vaccine was approved and licensed. Vaccinations began immediately, and by 1957, the number of cases of polio in countries where the vaccine was available dropped by 90%. Living through those few years, you would not have heard of it becoming a thing in 1952. Trials in 1953. By 1957, that's 4 years later, 90% case drop. Living through those 4 years would be madness. Just seeing a disease which is ravaging people and destroying lives just almost snapped out of existence. That all sounds pretty great, and it's like people would have been universally on board with the polio vaccine. But something else happened in April of 1955 when the Salk vaccine was first rolled out. The Cutter incident. Is this the one where they had they accidentally shipped it with the live vaccine and they gave a bunch of people polio? That sucks. Cutter Laboratories in California was one of the sites where the vaccine was being manufactured, but they made a little whoopsie with one of their first batches. They forgot to kill the virus. There we go. Okay, they didn't actually forget, they just fucked up the process. Either way, the end result was the same. Over 200,000 children were injected with the live, fully powered polio virus, resulting in 40,000 cases of polio, 200 cases of permanent paralysis to varying degrees, and 10 fatalities. Christ. That is a disastrous mistake to make, and so there was a lot of pushback against the polio vaccine. Yeah, the real disaster there is not even necessarily the immediate deaths and disabilities. It's the fact that it's damaging trust in the polio vaccine, which you will go on to save millions? Billions? Don't know. Fortunately, an alternative came shortly after. In 1961, Polish-American virologist Albert Sabin received approval for his version of the polio vaccine, an oral vaccine that contained a live, attenuated version of the virus. This was pretty big for a number of reasons. First and foremost, it wasn't the Salk vaccine. There was nothing wrong with Salk's vaccine, but the Cutter incident was understandably a terrifying event for a lot of people. That was the only instance of a manufacturing error with the vaccine, but it was still the worst mistake they could have possibly made. Even if it was isolated to a single batch from a single facility, it was still going to scare the public. Yeah, it's going to scare the public off polio, and it's going to scare a smaller percentage, but I'm sure not insignificant, off vaccines in general, because you're just there in the doctors and you're like, I don't have this disease. Are you going to inject me with that disease? And they're like, yes, but it's dead. And you'd be like, are you sure? And they'd be like, sure as I can be. And you'd be like, oh no.
I'm so scared.
So from a public perception standpoint, not being the Salk vaccine was the most important thing, but from a logistics and distribution standpoint, being an oral vaccine was the most important. It was just a few drops of liquid in the mouth. Hell, you could even put the liquid on a sugar cube and give it to a kid to suck on. It didn't really matter how you got the kid to take it. What mattered was that it didn't require a medical professional to administer an injection. I think there were sugar cube vaccines when I was a kid. I vaguely remember going to the doctors when I was very young and being given a sugar cube with drops on it. Is that a false memory? That could entirely be a false memory if this went out of fashion in like the 1950s, but I vaguely remember that. This allowed quick and widespread vaccination of children, as teachers could just go from student to student with a tray of sugar cubes to vaccinate their class. Plus, kids all love sugar, and they don't love needles. Having once been a child that used to run around screaming like an idiot and hiding in closets from my fruitless efforts to avoid being given shots, an oral vaccine like this saves a lot of time. I remember once, this is another memory of being vaccinated as a child. The doctor was like, okay, we'll give you the vaccine. And I'm just staring at them about to put the needle in, just fascinated by it. And they're like, you want to watch? Like, but not like, you're interested in this. You want to watch? That's more how he said it. And I'm like, yeah, I want to see. And the doctor thought this was weird. I was just interested by it, There was also another added benefit, though this has been a concern with other vaccines, and most recently the COVID vaccine. The oral polio vaccine resulted in virus shedding, which also created contact immunity. Basically, if an unvaccinated person came into contact with someone who recently received the oral vaccine, they could become exposed to the attenuated polio virus as well, and thus gain immunity without actually being vaccinated. Oh, that's genius. We should try and make all vaccines like that. Then even the people who don't want vaccines are going to get it from us. Yes! Suddenly I'd want to have dinner with the crazy friends who don't vaccinate. Who I definitely don't have. While this was seen as a benefit, the idea of virus shedding from vaccines has caused a lot of concerns, especially from people who are opposed to vaccines. Well, you're not getting a vaccine, are you? Technically. However, it is important to note that God damn it, why do I keep saying oral as Oreo? However, it is important to note that the oral polio vaccine is the only confirmed instance of virus shedding from a live vaccine ever causing contact infections. I did mention the rotavirus vaccine causing shedding as well, but the shedding was isolated to the person's poop, so there aren't any known cases of the rotavirus vaccine accidentally causing infections. Given what would be required for it to happen, hopefully there aren't any unknown cases either. It's also worth noting that the majority of vaccines are not live viruses, so shedding would never even be possible in the first place. Anyway, once again, this all sounds great, but there was another problem. Although this had been a problem since the start, it didn't really receive a lot of attention until 1989 when John Salomone's son, David, was given the oral polio vaccine. Unfortunately, the vaccine caused a condition known as vaccine-associated paralytic poliomyelitis. That's a fancy way of saying that the virus gave him polio. Although it was rare, this happens with roughly 1 in every 2.4 million doses of the oral vaccine. That's about 1 in every 750,000 first doses, as the polio vaccine takes multiple doses. Alright, I mean, it's very, very unlikely. You just, like, if someone was like, do you want to take this? I'd be like, yeah. Yeah, do I like the fact that every 2.4 million doses is going to happen? No. Am I willing to play those odds? Yes. Although the virus was weakened, it was specifically weakened to prevent growth in the nervous system, which is where polio attacks. But it wasn't weakened to prevent growth in the intestines, which is where things you swallow tend to wind up. I gotta say, I think I'd go for the Salk vaccine. The original one, right? Because you don't have this risk. And I'm assuming the Cutter incident was... I mean, that was just an error. I think I'll take the injection one. I mean, although the odds are so small. Once the attenuated virus was swallowed and made its way to the nervous system, then things would be fine and all would go according to plan. Until then, however, it could hang out for a bit in the intestines where it would replicate and thusly mutate. And in rare cases, it would mutate into a virus that would cause an actual polio infection. This is what happened to David, who they later discovered had a genetic condition that gave him a weakened immune system, meaning that he potentially shouldn't have been given live vaccines in the first place. Yeah, okay, so all the people who have weakened immune systems, give them the jab. John Salamone formed a group, Parents Against Vaccine-Associated Paralytic Polio, to lobby against the Sabin polio vaccine. If this was a modern day, that would absolutely not be a group, it would be a Facebook group. And he was treated pretty poorly because of this. John was seen as the first high-profile anti-vax advocate in the United States, but this wasn't the case at all. He wasn't lobbying against the use of vaccines, or even against vaccines being mandatory for school admission. The Salk vaccine, using inactivated viruses, predated the Sabin vaccine, and it was safe and effective. Except for that one time when it emphatically was not. John's platform was simply that the US should stop using the live vaccine and switch exclusively to the inactivated vaccine. He was advocating vaccine safety, not vaccine denial, because he didn't want anyone else to needlessly contract polio the way that his son had. Alright, well, John sounds like a stand-up dude. I just said that this is what should be done, right? I said that I'd rather take the injectable one. And he was absolutely correct. Many other countries didn't use the live vaccine anymore, and some had never used it in the first place. This was the late 1980s, by which point polio had been all but eradicated in the United States. Since 1980, there had been a single case of anyone catching polio in the wild, but there were still about 7 to 10 new cases of polio each year, all of them caused by the live vaccine. Back in the 1950s and even 1960s, that could have been seen as acceptable. Polio had been killing 500,000 people each year, so if 1 in 2.4 million doses of vaccine caused polio, you could easily argue the benefits outweigh the risks. But in the 1980s, when polio had gone, and the only cases were those caused by the vaccine, well, suddenly the risk versus reward diagram looked a lot different. Yeah, assuming that there is that herd immunity, right? Assuming that it's just not in the ecosystem anymore. The fact that this situation even existed in the first place can be traced back to the Cutter incident and what was arguably an overreaction to what happened. Still, man, that Cutter incident is responsible for so much pain. And not the immediate pain. There's that, of course, but the fear. Don't get me wrong, what happened was horrible, but it created a fear among policymakers that prevented them from switching back exclusively to the inactivated vaccine. Because of their decision to continue using the oral vaccine long after it made sense to do so, over 150 children contracted polio in the US after the disease had already been effectively eliminated. Eventually, policymakers came around, and as of 2000, the US stopped using the oral polio vaccine. John also finally got the credit he deserved for his efforts, despite how unfairly he was initially treated. However, this may have created a problem. I don't want to propose a direct causal link between John's efforts and what came after him, but after he gained recognition for his efforts to improve vaccine safety, a whole lot of other groups and individuals began lobbying to make changes as well. Oh no, but John's made sense. I get the feeling these new ones are not going to make sense. You know what would make sense? Getting yourself some Gamer Subs, by the way. I'm just enjoying this Gamer Subs right now. It's full of caffeine, it tastes delicious, and if you go to gamersubs.gg/ lost my link. / unknown. I got a list of links here, and I was going to read the wrong one. But it's gamersubs.gg / unknown. You won't regret it. Much like taking a vaccine. Cheers. Unfortunately, while John had a very specific and reasonable complaint based in medical science, the same cannot be said for everyone that came after him. Andrew Wakefield and the rise of misinformation. All right, here we go. Andrew Cockface Wakefield. It was the early morning hours of March 23rd, 1963, and Maurice Hilleman had been fast asleep. At around 1 a.m., his 5-year-old daughter, Geraldine, came into the bedroom to wake him up because she didn't feel well. She had a fever and a swollen throat, unmistakably symptomatic of the mumps. Hilleman wanted to do everything he could to make his daughter feel better, but he was also a scientist who knew an opportunity when he saw one. He rushed to his lab, grabbed some cotton swabs and a vial of nutrient broth, and then came home to swab Geraldine's throat and put it in the broth to cultivate the virus. Look, if I was a scientist, I don't like this, but I know that I would be this guy. I'm just like looking at the injection, I'm just curious. I'd just be like, cool, let's have a crack at this, shall we? I don't like it, but I'm that guy. Hilleman had created multiple vaccines by this point, and throughout his career, he's credited with creating 40 vaccines in total. He was able to weaken the mumps virus to a state that would be suitable for a vaccine, but he was going to need human test subjects. Luckily for him, he had another daughter to test his new vaccine on, the 1-year-old Kirsten. Okay, that's not me. I'd be interested in getting it in my lab and messing around with it, and then I'd just be like, nah, I'm not going to infect my kids. I'll just take it to the playground and rub it in some random kid's face.
That is a fantastic idea.
I'm not going to do that either. I'm just joking. Just joking. That may sound... I'm also not a scientist. I'm not even going to do any of this. I don't need to say that. This may sound unethical and irresponsible, but mumps is extremely contagious. Kirsten was already at risk from her sister, so quickly developing a vaccine would be better than risking the young child becoming naturally infected by her sister. Okay, cool. Look, scientist is science-y. Of course he is. He's rational. He's a rational man. He knows the risks. He knows what's happening. This is the sort of thing that I'd really struggle to explain to my wife. And my wife is a fairly rational person, but she doesn't have that, just a hardcore rationality that I have. And I'll just be like, yeah, okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this... look, Remus has the mumps. So I'm going to try making a vaccine before Romulus gets it. And then she'll be like, you're not giving that to Romulus. And I'll be like, why not? I mean, he's going to get it anyway. And she'll be like, yeah, I don't want you to give it to him, though. And I'll be like, but it could make him not get the mumps. And she'll be like, no. And I'll be like, there would be no winning. To this day, the original Geraldine strain of the mumps vaccine is still used. Whether you live in the US or the UK, the mumps vaccine you received was cultivated from that original cotton swab Hilleman took from his daughter. That's cool. Hilleman, this feels so nerdy to think that that's super cool, but it is cool. Hilleman also developed the mumps vaccine that's used in the MMR vaccine, as well as several other vaccines that you probably required to get in order to attend school. Similarly, both Salk and Sabin tested their polio vaccines on themselves and their own families before testing them on the general public. Yeah, but it's a bit different with polio, right? It's polio. And in a 1955 interview, when Salk was asked who owns the patent to the polio vaccine, he replied, "Well, the people, I would say. There is no patent. Could you patent the sun?" Legend. That is so legendary. He could get so I don't know. I'd patent that. I know it's a bad thing to do, but I'd be like, okay, look, I know it's good for humanity, but I also really want to be a billionaire. I don't know, man. You'd just be like, okay, look, a bunch more people are going to die for like 8 years. Oh, yeah, no, that sounds terrible. But you got to admit, that's really hard. What a legend, though. I don't know if I could do the same thing. If I could patent the sun, I'd patent. Sabin similarly refused to patent his vaccine, believing instead that widespread vaccination was too important and that it needed to be as cheaply and as readily available as possible. Hillerman was working for Merck when he developed his vaccines, though, so he isn't able to be quite so magnanimous with his inventions, as Merck owned the patents. Okay, so why am I telling you any of this? One of the criticisms about vaccines is that it's all big pharma lying to you, selling you dangerous untested medications to line their pockets. Now, on the surface, that's not the craziest leap to make, as big pharma is notoriously and unquestionably evil. Yeah, is the motivation there? Yes. But the evil stuff all comes from executives and salesmen and whatnot. The scientists behind medications generally care about their work and about saving people's lives. You don't meet a lot of scientists and like medical people who are in it. I don't know, maybe in America it's different because doctors get paid so much. But I don't think there's a lot of people who are in medicine or science for the money, typically. Maybe that's a bit naive. As previous stories show, they believed in their work, so much so that they were tested on themselves and their families, and when possible, they gave the vaccines away for as close to free as possible because saving lives mattered more than money. So I'm not a scientist. Oh, I'm a bad person. Even doctors behind drugs that are known to be harmful weren't necessarily evil. When Dr. Robert Keiko created OxyContin, he was trying to develop a controlled-release version of oxycodone that he hoped would be less addictive and prone to abuse. It is generally believed that not only did he warn about the dangers of abuse of OxyContin before it was released, which was possible before Keiko was ready for it to be released, and at a patent hearing over the drug, Keiko freely admitted that they had done no studies and had absolutely no evidence to prove the claims of 12-hour effectiveness that Purdue Pharma was advertising. In short, Big Pharma is evil, but the scientists creating the drugs usually are not. And as evil as pharmaceutical companies may be, I think, Kevin, I don't think pharmaceutical companies are evil. I just think they're devoid of evil or goodness. They are just profit-making machines. It's a company. That's what it does. It's first order of business to the shareholder. That doesn't make them evil. It just means they can do evil things. And that doesn't make them good either. It just means sometimes they do good things. Mostly evil. Mostly evil, in my opinion. And talking about no particular company in particular, like Purdue. Purdue's still around. As evil as pharmaceutical companies may be, there's no profit to be made by selling deadly and unsafe drugs, unless they're also highly addictive and usually take quite a while to kill the person. I was just thinking, oh shit, wait, what about the OxyContin thing? But nobody's out on the corner trying to buy some caps of polio vaccine to keep from getting dope sick. If a person is only going to need 1 or 2 doses of a medication, you don't need to make any money by deliberately selling them poison, especially since vaccines are usually given to children. When it comes to non-addictive medications like vaccine, the real money is in making a highly effective product before your competitors do. That way you can get a patent and have de facto monopoly on the medication for 20 years or so. Oh, is it 20 years? For some reason I thought it was just 8 years. 20 years. That's a long time. And then when the patent is almost up, you just make a minor tweak so that you can extend the patent. I mean, yeah, but doesn't then the original non-tweaked version become public? Right? No? But that only works if the product works. If you create a vaccine that doesn't work or has a high incidence of side effects, well, the second a competitor comes out with a better vaccine, you can kiss your entire market share goodbye. I know it can be hard for a lot of people to trust pharmaceutical companies, but it is genuinely in their best interest to make the best vaccines possible. And then they can take the money those make and invest it in more nefarious schemes like creating new and even more addictive narcotics. Despite all of this, however, there is at least one doctor relevant to today's episode who is purely motivated by greed, Andrew Wakefield. Back in 1796, Edward Jenner became the father of the vaccine, and 200 years later, Andrew Wakefield became the father of the anti-vax movement. But Wakefield wasn't interested in helping people. All he cared about was money, and much like Sir Mix-a-Lot, Wakefield was also really into butt stuff. He was a senior lecturer and honorary consultant in experimental gastroenterology at the Royal Free Hospital School of Medicine. Butts weren't just Wakefield's work and passion, they were the way he was going to become filthy fucking rich. All he had to do was invent a fake problem that he could then sell the solution to. It began with a 1993 paper in which Wakefield linked the measles virus with Crohn's disease, a type of inflammatory bowel disease. Now, if you're unfamiliar with the condition, well, it's a bowel disease, so you could probably guess what most of the symptoms are. 2 years later, he published a paper in The Lancet, a respected medical journal, claiming a link between the MMR vaccine and Crohn's disease. This never took off and was quickly disproven, but it did at least show Wakefield that despite being a respected peer-reviewed journal, he could get any old tripe that he wanted published in The Lancet. I could go off on a whole thing about abuses with the peer review process right now, but honestly, that'd probably be better as a topic for Into the Shadows. Yeah, I'm vaguely familiar with this. It is kind of crazy. Anyway, in 1995, Wakefield was approached by Rosemary Kasich, the mother of a child who had both autism and bowel problems. She was also the leader of a group called Allergy-Induced Autism, which made it clear she was willing to blame anything except genetics for her child's autism. This was a golden opportunity for Wakefield. He had failed to establish a link between the MMR vaccine and Crohn's disease, but what if he could establish one between the vaccine and autism? No, that would be too obvious. He already tried that once and failed, so he needed some out-of-the-box thinking. Instead of linking the vaccine directly to autism, or what if this new condition, autistic enterocolitis? He could call this new condition autistic enterocolitis and claim it was a new bowel disease that was directly caused by the measles vaccine, which in turn directly caused autism. Well, it's not direct then, is it? It's indirect. And it's also not real. It was the perfect plan, and Wakefield's key to becoming wealthy beyond his wildest dreams. All he needed to do now was conduct a study that suggested a causal link between these things and get it published in The Lancet. So, that's exactly what he did. Wakefield was the lead author of a 12-author paper titled Ileal Lymphoid Nodular Hyperplasia, Non-Specific Colitis, and Pervasive Developmental Disorder in Children. The paper was rather sedate, merely suggesting a link between the MMR vaccine, subsequent gastrointestinal disease, and even more subsequent development regression in children. In fact, the paper explicitly said it did not prove that vaccines caused this. But it doesn't really matter what the paper said, because who the fuck reads scientific research papers? I mean, I do because it's part of my job, but I definitely didn't before writing for Simon. Besides, why bother reading the paper when Wakefield was doing a media blitz to report his findings anyway? However, when he talked about the research publicly, Wakefield was far less reserved than the actual paper, which is fairly common, to be fair. He explicitly stated that his research had linked the MMR vaccine to autism and urged parents to demand getting separate shots instead of the 3-in-1 vaccine they'd used for decades. The same day, I know where this is going, he's made his own. He's made his own single-shot vaccine that people are going to buy. This is so shady. The same day that his paper was published in The Lancet, Wakefield held a press conference to publicize the link between vaccines and autism, the link which his paper said they explicitly hadn't proven. Again, though, who reads research papers? Certainly not the media, even though the paper was only 5 pages long. Journalists, come on! Make an effort! They couldn't be bothered to read it. Instead, they just reported on the things Wakefield was publicly claiming, assuming that the paper probably had some pretty good evidence. This got a ton of media attention, with newspapers, magazines, and TV news anchors all discussing Wakefield's talking points about the link between the MMR vaccine and autism. Yeah, it's going to be really hard to put the genie back in the bottle. More specifically, Wakefield's claim was that the measles vaccine was the one causing autism, and that's why parents needed to urge their doctors to give the vaccine separately instead of in a single shot. The media ran with this claim, pushing it onto the public constantly, despite of the lack of, well, wait a minute, this doesn't even make any sense. Wakefield, the father of the modern anti-vax movement, claimed that the MMR vaccine caused autism, but he didn't tell parents to refuse vaccination for their children. Instead, he told them to demand their children get the measles, mumps, and rubella vaccines one at a time and 1 year apart instead of taking them all together. He explicitly stated that he was not anti-vaccine on numerous occasions, though in later years he changed his opinion on that in order to not alienate his supporters. So initially, this isn't as morally bankrupt as you think. It's morally bankrupt, but not outrageously so. He's kind of making something up. He is making something up. He's stating something as fact that he knows not to be fact, just speculation. And with the idea that people aren't going to get the triple jab in one, they're going to get 3 separate jabs. So he's probably thinking, well, no one's going to get any more sick. They're just going to get 3 separate jabs. The fact that I sell one of them is just going to make me rich. Is it less efficient? Is it a waste of taxpayer or people's money? Absolutely. Is it going to kill people? No. No, it's not. It's probably how his thinking went. I mean, it's still morally bankrupt, but it's not as bad as like, oh no, I'm going to sacrifice people by telling people I'm anti-vax and not to get it. So what was his motivation here? It's money, Kevin. It was money. If the measles portion of the MMR vaccine was causing autism, why was he still recommending that parents get all 3 vaccines individually? Well, it turns out Wakefield wasn't actually anti-vax. He was just pro-cash. You see, his paper linking vaccines to autism by way of diarrhea was published in 1998, but in 1997 he submitted 2 patent applications. One was for a diagnostic test that would check for autistic endocarditis, and the other was for a new measles vaccine. Surprise! The vaccine that not only promised to be safer than the one currently in use, but that may also have the ability to treat and even cure both inflammatory bowel disease and autism. Bro. He's like, yeah, this one might cure autism as well. Yes, please. Give me some money. The co-inventor of this measles vaccine was one Hugh Fudenberg, a disgraced former doctor whose research was cited in Wakefield's work. Fudenberg lost his medical license in 1995 for gross ethical violations and for stealing controlled substances from his work, substances he was personally using. To speculate here, he was stealing addictive drugs. Substances from his work. He's stealing whatever the 1990s version of OxyContin was. Maybe morphine. I don't know. You can even get, it's called diamorphine or diamorphone or something, which is heroin. And the UK prescribes this. I think it's maybe the only country in the world to have heroin as a prescription medication, I think, for hospice care. The paper he wrote that Wakefield cited in his work was published by a fringe medical journal for quack doctors, and it was written after Fudenberg's license was already revoked. Oh yes, and Fudenberg also claimed to be able to cure autism by giving people his own personal bone marrow. Bitch must have taken a lot of controlled substances who believed that he was so special and magical that his body was the cure for autism. This is so weird. At that point, he may as well have claimed that the cure was his semen rather than his bone marrow and just formed a cult like a normal narcissist. But I'm getting off track here. Jesus Christ. The only way that this works is if you suck it out. What the dude. Not that I know that's not real, but it's just up. Not only did Wakefield have a financial conflict of interest by patenting his own measles vaccine and diagnostic tests for autistic enterocolitis, but he was also being paid a considerable amount of money to do this research as well. You see, Wakefield had been approached by Richard Barr, a lawyer representing an anti-vax group called Justice Awareness and Basic Support, or JABS. It began as a small group of concerned parents who noticed their children develop illnesses shortly after getting the MMR vaccine. And by the time Barr hired Wakefield, it was still a small group. Isn't this just a timeline thing? Like, the point that your children are getting vaccinated is also going to be a similar point, you know, because they go in and they do these comprehensive checkups. Like, I don't know, my kid has to go in. At first, it's like week 1, then twice a week, then once a month, and then once every 6 months, and then once a year. And they just come in for their checkups, and they do these things to make sure that they're developing normally and stuff. They ask them questions, blah, blah, blah. And I imagine at the same time that they're getting these vaccines is also probably when they're going to diagnose autism at about the same point, maybe. So it's, again, a case of correlation, not causation here. But a class action lawsuit against vaccine manufacturers would be a fucking massive payout, so it was worth pursuing. Barr paid Wakefield £150 per hour plus expenses to conduct research proving some sort of link between the MMR vaccine and autism. This was in the 90s, dude. That's a lot. Like £150 a day, you'd be like, that's decent. But this was the 90s. The children involved in the study were also provided by JABS, all 12 of them. So we have some more conflicts of interest there. Oh, and in addition to patenting the test for autistic enterocolitis, Wakefield also created a company that would market and sell the tests. In a pitch to investors, he stated the diagnostic tests could produce $35 million revenue each year. A lot of this wasn't revealed until years later, in 2004, when British investigative journalist Brian Deere published his report on Wakefield in the Sunday Times. I have never read that, and I'm surprised. That sounds great. I will probably go read that after this. Wakefield had, although I'm probably going to take my lunch in a little bit. Maybe I'll read it over lunch. Wakefield had already been fired and moved to the US by the time all of these conflicts of interests were brought to light, but he filed a lawsuit against Deere claiming libel. Sorry, did I say fired? I meant resigned by mutual agreement. He definitely was not fired, wink wink. Yeah, I mean, also, Deere is writing for the Sunday Times, who definitely will have vetted the piece before it goes out. So I'm not too concerned about Deere. It's a civil suit. If anyone's paying, the Times is paying. They're covering the legal costs. I don't think Deere's in any big trouble here. Deere's a legend, in my opinion. I don't need to say, in my opinion. He's a legend. He's not going to sue me for calling him a legend. What's wrong with you, Simon? Anyway, this lawsuit was filed in the UK since both Deere and Wakefield were British, but they have similar law surrounding libel that we do in the US. The truth is an absolute defense against any claims of libel or defamation. Oh no, so my calling him a cockface, that's a problem, because that's not demonstrably true. In fact, it's not true, but it is a joke. And I think also jokes, that's just joke. It's just a joke. Oh, God. I mean, all of this is allegedly, in my opinion, right? Remember that. It's just my opinion. Even if I state something as an absolute fact, it's just my opinion that it's an absolute fact. If it can be proven that what you're saying is true, no matter how damaging it may be to a person, then you cannot be held liable. This did create a bit of an issue, though. In order to prove that he was telling the truth, Deere would need access to Wakefield's research, but that research was protected by doctor-patient confidentiality. I'm like, just get in and discovery. Something that was even more tricky, as many of the people involved in the study were minors. The judge spent a good amount of time weighing these protections against one another, but he ultimately decided that Deere would have access to all of Wakefield's unredacted research for the purposes of proving his defense. Yes, and this is a journalist who's got access to all of this stuff. He's going to be able to tell a story. He just couldn't release any of it to the public, which is more than fair. Okay. I really hope Deere writes a book later, like the O.J. Simpson book. Like, if I did it, this is how, or whatever. He should be like, if I'm talking about Andrew Wakefield, this is how I would talk about it. But I'm not. It's just a story. Unfortunately for Wakefield, he hadn't really counted on this ruling. More than that, he still had a lot of stuff to hide. And though Deere was allowed to look through the research with his lawyers, Wakefield's lawyers quickly dropped the case so that Deere couldn't look at them anymore. Almost as the judge is like, you got to burn those. Be like, sure, yeah, I just burned them. Definitely burned them last night. Yes, judgy. Almost as if they had something to hide. Obviously, this led Deere to believe that he needed to keep digging, and what he found was even worse than the conflicts of interest. You've made a tactical error here, Wakefield, because Wakefield's lawyers, because he's not got access to that. He's got access to that stuff. In the case, the judge has said, you're not allowed to talk about this. Case is over. And now he knows there's something to hide. He's going to dig. He's going to spend years digging because he's a journalist. That's what he's paid to do. And he's going to uncover this. You made a tactical error. Deere discovered that Wakefield had faked the results. Even though the test subjects had been handpicked from parents who believed the MMR vaccine had caused their children's autism, Wakefield still had to lie and fake the results. At least 2 of the 12 participants were never diagnosed with autism, and Wakefield also lied about when they presented symptoms. Also, I probably need to explain why the test subjects being handpicked was so important, because it's not a random sampling. Wakefield was investigating a connection between the MMR vaccine, gastrointestinal issues, and autism. Yeah, so he picked people who potentially have autism and gastrointestinal issues. This isn't a study, it's hogwash. However, there wasn't any scientific evidence to support this, even in his own paper. Wakefield's paper cited the parents' belief that the vaccine caused autism to support his conclusion. It wasn't doctors performing science, it was just vibes from the parents. All the paper really did was document when the children received their MMR vaccine, what intestinal issues they had, and when they presented symptoms of autism. That's not to say that no scientific tests were performed, and the children were subjected to a number of painful and invasive procedures that have been likened to child abuse. The parents also weren't able to give informed consent for those procedures, as they were never made aware of the considerable risks that some of those tests posed. Wakefield, unsurprisingly, had his medical license revoked, but he still had his fame and notoriety. He had to lean into the concept that all vaccines were dangerous, rather than just a single vaccine that he wanted to sell an alternative for. Otherwise, he would have lost financial support from his fans, but he continued to publicize his theories despite a lack of evidence. Is it just my imagination, or didn't he end up in Australia for some reason? That may not be a surprise, but what is a surprise to many is that this single paper is the only evidence linking vaccines to autism. Evidence. It's not evidence. It's a made-up study where they lied. Wakefield was paid to conduct this research by a lawyer who wanted to sue vaccine manufacturers for a mint. He had his own financial conflicts of interest and stood on to make tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars, off claiming a link, and he falsified the data in order to make it fit the narrative that he wanted. But despite all of this, what if Wakefield was right? He was a lying piece of shit who was exploiting children for his own financial gain, but that doesn't mean he couldn't have been onto something. I mean, sure, in the same way he could have also been onto the cure for cancer, but he isn't, and he wasn't. Just, what? I mean, his own research didn't suggest that in any meaningful way, but what if he accidentally was right for all of the wrong reasons? Okay, for better or worse, that is something the scientific community actually considered. Wakefield had spent so much time publicizing his claims, and they were out in the world now. A lot of that is also thanks to the inordinate amount of coverage his claims were given in the mainstream media, even though they lacked any evidence. Regardless, news agencies had been reporting on a possible link between vaccines and autism for years now. Also, he started with a little kernel of not truth, but the doubt was already there. So this makes even more sense. Why he would pursue it, I mean. So it was in the best interest of doctors to perform studies to see if they could determine any possible link. And they could not. Even though these resources arguably could have been spent on better things, a lot of experiments were done to try and confirm any causal link between vaccines and autism. None of these experiments showed anything even hinting at the idea that a link might exist. But that's really not surprising. After all, Wakefield had been fired by the Royal Free Hospital for refusing to do another study. I mean, and then he was also had his medical license revoked. Which is, if you're a doctor, really serious. They weren't even saying they didn't believe him either. Wakefield's original research was only conducted on 12 kids, which is an utterly meaningless sample size. The hospital wanted him to conduct a larger trial that would give more conclusive results, and realistically, they would have wanted him to succeed. Sure, Wakefield would get most of the credit, but as the institute where he worked and the ones who funded his large-scale research, it would help them out as well. Not like the Royal Free Hospital was desperate for name recognition or anything, but you can never have too much grant money or donations. No, I mean, that's right. Like, universities want to make breakthroughs because then it's going to get them more money from research institutes and people in the future. I've got a friend in academia. It's got a lot to do with money. Wakefield originally agreed to do the study, but after a few years of dragging his feet and not even attempting to progress his research, he finally resigned and was definitely not fired. Again, his singular paper is the only evidence linking autism and vaccines. He also never gave a good answer as to why taking the 3 vaccines separately instead of all together would have been any safer if the measles vaccine was supposedly unsafe. While there had been some real risks and problems with the 2 polio vaccines, there was never any credible danger with the MMR vaccine. And yet, fueled purely by greed, Andrew Wakefield created an entire movement of people opposed to vaccines. But not all lies regarding the safety or dangers of vaccines have come from disgraced former doctors who were looking to enrich themselves. Sometimes the lies come directly from the very government agencies that the public relies on for their protection. Lies from the CDC. The COVID pandemic, it was a wild time. Not wild in the sense that it was full of raging parties, unless you were Boris Johnson, that is. Oh, I love that Kevin's an American and he still knows about Boris Johnson's COVID parties. Jesus. But it was unlike anything the world had seen in over a century since the Spanish flu. Sure, there had been other pandemics since, like swine flu, but nothing that caused the same level of global disruption. Yes, swine flu was just like, what, like bird flu, swine flu, all of this shit. I was like, what? Nothing ever came of it. Like, I think the last one that people were really afraid of that I remember was BSE, like mad cow disease. And people were like, can't eat beef. In the UK, it was a really big deal. And yeah, swine flu, bird flu, none of that shit. I don't care. Unless you were considered an essential employee, that is. My daily life barely changed during COVID, except I was finally allowed to wear jeans to work, and I had to hang out with my friends in Animal Crossing and Among Us instead of in person. What is Animal Crossing? I've heard of Among Us. But then a year into the pandemic, there was a breakthrough. The first COVID vaccines were developed and given emergency authorization, and the world let out a unanimous sigh of relief. Yeah, I remember when that happened. It was like, oh, thank God, we can get a jab and to go outside. And they did let us outside. You'd have like your vaccine card and you'd be able to go outside. Just kidding. Oh wait, no, what? Most people's reaction to the use of COVID vaccine was, that was fast. Are you sure this thing works? I don't know, man. I was inside for so long that I was like, f*** it. They'll be like, yeah, it's slightly experimental. It's like a 5% chance it kills you. Obviously, not true. Just making this up. But I'll be like, stick it in my arm. I'm going outside. This reaction was exacerbated by the fact that it was the first ever use of an mRNA vaccine in humans. Admittedly, I had a similar reaction. I was more than happy to be first in line for the second wave of vaccines, but like many others, I saw the first wave as essentially the test subjects for the vaccine. Yep, completely agree. And the good thing is for regular healthy people, like Kevin and myself, is they gave it to all the people who were needing it most first. So if you're like immunocompromised or whatever, they're like, you got to come in and get your jab first. There's jabs for you. Or all the rich people in America somehow buying their access to vaccines and stuff like this really super early on and be like, okay, you guys take it. I'll wait inside for like a month. I can handle that. And we'll just see if you get any pig's heads out of your arms or anything. Cow heads? What was it? Cow heads. Cowpox. Cow heads. And this was the start of the CDC's failure to communicate properly, as these fears were unfounded. Even though this was the first time they were being approved for human use, mRNA vaccines weren't exactly new. They were first used on animals back in the 1990s, and there have been human trials of mRNA vaccines for both Zika and rabies. Initial trials resulted in some fine-tuning of the technology to increase its efficacy, but the results were very positive. Also, while COVID was referred to as a novel coronavirus, it was still a coronavirus. We'd seen things very similar to this before, like SARS and MERS, and there were mRNA vaccines developed for both of those viruses over a decade earlier. Both showed very positive results in animal testing, but the outbreaks of the previous viruses died down enough that human trials weren't necessary. Basically, the vaccine was developed so quickly because it was essentially already done before the pandemic even hit. We had mRNA vaccines for SARS-CoV-1, usually just called SARS, so all they had to do was change it to target the spike proteins on SARS-CoV-2, aka COVID. They weren't reinventing the wheel or anything. The work was like 90% done before it even started. I still understand, even if this was fully explained, I feel people can get lost in this. It's already a bit complicated. I imagine that several of you who are listening to this might have just slightly switched off in the last 45 seconds or so, and I think that's because when this stuff is explained, people tend to gloss over it. Their minds tend to glaze over a little bit. And also, you're just like, yeah, but it's still new. It's still new. Human trials were done, but then why wasn't it approved? Why is this not approved? Why are we taking this? This feels scary. I think even if the CDC had said it like this, and laid it out, I think it wouldn't have made that much of a difference. While it would have been fantastic if this could have been explained properly to the general public, there was a bigger problem once the vaccines were approved for use. The CDC told people to get the vaccine and said if they did, everyone would be fine. They essentially said, get the vaccine, you won't get sick. This was never going to be the case though, and they knew it. I mean, yeah, but I get why they're lying. They say it because they just need people to go out there and get it, so they can get as many people vaccinated as possible. It's a harmless lie, but it is going to damage trust in that institution. Now, at the beginning of this episode, we talked about what happens when your body encounters a pathogen. You create antibodies to fight off the infection, then these create memory cells that will prevent future infections. If you recall, though, I said there was a caveat to that. Yes, these memory cells would protect a person against future infections, but it's not an instantaneous process. These things take time, and time isn't always on our side. COVID has a short incubation period, which means that it could begin replicating and cause an infection before the memory cells had time to jump into action. That's not to say that vaccines weren't useful, though. Because our bodies were able to fight off the infection faster and more efficiently than if they weren't memory cells, it greatly reduced the risk of severe or life-threatening cases of COVID. You could still get sick, it would probably just be mild and not require hospitalization. I'll fucking take it, dude, I'll take it. I mean, I did take it. I think that's fine. I'd like it to be mild, thank you very much. Of course, if the antibodies were still present, then you wouldn't get sick at all, but that complete protection only lasted for a few months. That's why boosters were recommended, as it would replenish your supply of antibodies, which should be able to stave off infection entirely. That all is far more complicated and nuanced than anything the CDC actually said, especially initially, which was a huge problem. They promised everyone that if they got vaccinated, then they wouldn't get sick, but people who got the vaccine got sick anyway. As a result, people thought the CDC was lying, and they really were. The vaccine was safe and beneficial, but they were promising far more than it could actually deliver, and once vaccinated, people started getting sick, despite the CDC's claims that this wasn't happening, and it created a lot of distrust and increased vaccine hesitancy. Now, I realize you can't go deep into the science behind this in a press conference for the general public, because it's just too much information. It's been glossing over in our minds, right? When things get too technical and complex, people's eyes start to glaze. I keep saying gloss over, but I mean glaze over. Glaze over and they just tune out. People want easy answers, so the CDC gave them what they wanted, even if it was a lie. They eventually changed their messaging to accurately reflect that the vaccine would prevent serious cases of COVID, but that it was still possible to get sick with a mild case. By that point, the damage to the public trust was already done. Wow, this was a tactical error, wasn't it? This was a huge one. Another issue in messaging came when the bivalent vaccine was introduced. COVID was constantly mutating, but the original vaccines were all based off the original Wuhan strain. Researchers decided that since Omicron had become the dominant strain, the vaccine should contain half a dose of the original strain and half a dose of Omicron. That certainly made sense at the time, and there was nothing inherently wrong with this plan. The problem came when the CDC and other health organizations began insisting that this new bivalent vaccine was better than the original, something that the data did not support. It's not like this was a new Coke situation where the formula was significantly worse than the original, it just wasn't any better either, it was effectively the same. Isn't it technically better because it's dealing with two variants? It's going to have the same results, but it's going to help you with immunity against two variants, so is that technically wrong? It's better than the original, kind of is. But they didn't want to admit that. They needed people to continue getting vaccinated for public safety. And if they said, well, we made this new vaccine that we thought would be better, but it isn't. But it's all good because it's not worse either. That's not going to instill a lot of faith in the public. It kind of makes it sound like they don't know what the hell they're doing. So instead, they lied. And the official stance was that the bivalent vaccine was better. To be fair, this was a lie that was unlikely to be called out very much. When the CDC promised the vaccine would keep people from getting sick and they got sick anyway, that's an easy thing to notice. But to recognize that the bivalent vaccine had the same efficacy as the original vaccine would require actually reading the research and understanding what it was saying. That's not to say that I condone dishonesty, just that it was much less likely to cause controversy or increase vaccine hesitancy. However, it's also important to point out a difference between these lies and the lies told by Andrew Wakefield. I guess it kind of depends on your stance on moral relativism. Anyway, Wakefield lied and falsified research specifically for personal profit. Yeah, the CDC's lying because they want a result. Sorry, so does Andrew Wakefield. He wants to get rich. The CDC are lying because they want a result that's going to be beneficial for the entire population as a whole, not the individual one. The CDC's got, they're doing the old Jeremy Bentham utilitarianism. That is Jeremy Bentham, right? Please tell me that's Jeremy Bentham. It would be embarrassing if I get it wrong. The philosopher who came up with utilitarianism. Spock. The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. The CDC, on the other hand, was lying to increase the percentage of people that got vaccinated for the health and safety of all Americans. There will always be some amount of people who, through no fault of their own, have immune systems that are so compromised that they can't handle vaccines. The only way to protect these people is by herd immunity. Even though there were people whose immune systems couldn't handle the smallpox virus, we were still able to eliminate smallpox by vaccinating everybody else, as there was no one to transmit the virus to these vulnerable people. Would I have preferred if the CDC found a more honest way to explain what the COVID vaccine would do without overloading people with science talk? Yes, absolutely. But at least their goals were altruistic, even if they were utilizing a ends justifies the means strategy. Machiavelli would have been so proud. Machiavelli and Bentham. Hopefully, Bentham. Common fears about vaccines. Now, thus far, we've talked about the history of vaccines and some specific incidents that went horribly wrong, but we haven't found anything yet that suggests vaccines are inherently unsafe. Now, I'd like to change tack and focus exclusively on specific fears that people still have regarding vaccines, so we can see if any of them have any validity. But first, I want to revisit autism for a moment. Even though Wakefield and his research have been fully discredited countless times, the idea that vaccines cause autism has persisted. This is despite the fact that his fraudulent paper is one of the only bits of evidence that such a link exists. In part, this is because Wakefield is a greedy piece of shit who continues to push this narrative for money, and it can also be blamed on the media for bombarding the public with sexy and controversial headlines without doing any actual investigation into the matter. It was a 5-page study, media, Jesus Christ. But there's something else at play here. I mentioned at the beginning of the episode that humans are really good at finding patterns. All right, yeah, that was a long time ago. Even when they don't exist, this leads to a little thing known as illusory correlation. It's a type of bias in which people perceive two things as being related even though they've got nothing to do with each other. In an interview, Dr. Paul, is this going to be about the autism getting diagnosed at about the same time that kids are getting their vaccines, right? In an interview, Dr. Paul Offit of the FDA Vaccines and Related Biological Products Advisory Committee, and formerly of the CDC Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, told a story that happened to his wife, who's a pediatrician. She was preparing to give a vaccine to a child when the child suddenly had a seizure. The child wound up being diagnosed with epilepsy and died at the age of 5. Had the seizure happened a minute later, it would have been after the vaccine was administered, and thus the child's parents would have almost certainly blamed the vaccine for the seizure, subsequent epilepsy, and the death of their child. Nothing would have been able to change their minds. Yeah, I am like a rational, deeply rational man, but I would still find it real hard to be like, nah. Even though I know I should. Because it's different when it happens to you. Now, I have no idea whether this anecdote is true or just a convenient fabrication, but it doesn't matter, because we know the underlying bias behind the story is true. It happens to all of us with some regularity. Maybe you've got a lucky pair of underwear that you need to wear whenever you watch your favourite sports team play, otherwise they'll lose. God knows a lot of the athletes on that team do. Or maybe you got really sick after getting Chinese food that one time and you never went back to that restaurant for years, even though it wasn't actually food poisoning. I'd like to think, and I think it's true, that I don't do this so much, but the one about the kid having the seizure, I'll be like, oh, it's really hard not to think it's that. You're not going to remember that 3 days earlier somebody coughed in your general direction at the grocery store. All you remember is that you ate from that one restaurant and immediately felt sick afterwards. Even if you logically know that the two are unrelated, it does not matter. Our brains are wired to pick up on these correlations as a matter of survival, and there's not much that can be done about it. Unfortunately, this illusory correlation has convinced many parents that vaccines caused autism, though admittedly few came to this conclusion on their own before the idea was endlessly repeated in the media. The MMR vaccine is usually given when a child is 12 to 15 months old. Symptoms of autism typically manifest when a child is 12 to 18 months old. Since the two things happen at roughly the same time, it's easy for someone to make the leap that they're related, especially when that idea has already been planted in your head. Of course, it's actually more complicated than that. After all, what does a baby do before they're 12 months old? Basically, all they do is cry, eat, and shit. I can testify that is correct. Would you even know if they were displaying symptoms of autism at that age? No. Probably not, though many infants do. The range of 12 to 18 months isn't actually when children first display signs of autism, it's when parents first notice them. There are actually signs before that. The parents are just not trained to pick up on them. In rare autism cases, children will also appear to develop normally, followed by a period of regression roughly between months 18 and 24 or so. These regressive cases were the autism cases that Wakefield's research focused on, because they were the ones whose typical pathology was most convenient for what he needed to be true in order to get paid. Allegedly. I don't want to beat a dead horse with this whole autism thing. I just think it's important to note just how critical illusory correlation was to the propagation of vaccine concerns. With that said, let's take a look at some of those other concerns about vaccines. These are generally concerns over their safety and the risk of potential side effects. We've already touched on vaccine shedding, as the live polio vaccine did cause virus shedding. Some people argue that it is virus shedding from the vaccines that cause people to get sick rather than the wild virus. In the case of polio, shedding turned out to be a good thing, but this is the only known case of this ever happening. There is no data to suggest that any other vaccine has caused infections from shedding. Even if it did, it would be shedding a weakened version of the virus, as happened with polio, that would provide contact immunity for unvaccinated people, which is a good thing. Let's make that the case all the time. The bigger concern is that vaccines are harmful to the people receiving them, not to the people around them, because they contain dangerous chemicals or have a high rate of allergic reactions. Now, can you have an allergic reaction to a vaccine? Of course you can. The human body is over 50% water, yet 1 in every 230 million people is allergic to water. Jesus, that must suck. If you can be allergic to water, clearly you can be allergic to anything, kinda. Allergies are responses from the immune system to things that are normally considered harmless, so you can't be allergic to the virus itself, at least not in the traditional sense. Viruses can still cause your body to freak out and produce histamines as part of its response, but it's not considered an allergy in the traditional sense. Regardless, the concern is more focused on additives to the vaccine anyway, and yes, they absolutely can cause allergic reactions. These are extremely rare, though. Yeah, my niece is allergic to eggs. And I think there was something about having to have like a different vaccine at some point because there was like some egg protein or something in one of the vaccines or some such. Maybe I'm misremembering, but it was something like this. These are extremely rare, though, and the risk of an allergic reaction is far lower than the risks posed by the diseases being vaccinated against. Of all the things added to vaccines, the substance most likely to cause severe allergic reactions is gelatin. Gelatin is used as a stabilizer in vaccines, especially vaccines that are freeze-dried. Allergic reactions to gelatin resulting in anaphylaxis occur in roughly 1 to 2 million doses of vaccine given. That's terrifying if it happens, but there's good news. Yeah, you're literally in a doctor's office. Other than maybe a hospital, best place for it to happen. First, when your young child is being vaccinated, they're probably in a hospital or a doctor's office. There's no good time to suffer from anaphylaxis, but that certainly would be the best time, as they'd receive immediate medical treatment. More importantly, should a child have an allergic reaction to the gelatin in a vaccine, most vaccines have a gelatin-free option so that they can receive their other required and necessary vaccines without incident. The gelatin-free options might be a little more expensive, but it's better than the alternative. And if you don't think 1 in 2 million odds are good enough, you can request gelatin-free vaccines from the start to avoid that possibility. Another claim is that vaccines contain dangerous chemicals, which again is vaguely true, sort of. But sticking with water as a counterpoint, you can die from water poisoning if you drink too much of it. For most things, however dangerous a chemical is, it all comes back to dosage. The 3 chemicals that are cited most often when it comes to the potential danger in vaccines are mercury, aluminium, and formaldehyde. Going all the way back to the 1930s, multi-dose bottles of vaccines contained thimerosal. Thimerosal is an antiseptic and antifungal that was used as a preservative in vaccines to prevent contamination. That seems smart. If you have a bottle containing 10 doses of a vaccine that you open and stick a needle into 10 times, by like the 7th or 8th dose, there would be a pretty good chance that outside bacteria may have found their way into the vial. I'm assuming we don't do it like this anymore. Like, I remember my nan was a doctor, and she was telling me, like, when I was a kid, that, when she first started practicing medicine or whatever, she was long retired when I knew her, but they'd reuse needles. Like, needles would be put in an autoclave and reused. I'm assuming that nowadays, the vaccine comes in a little thing, that little tub that they take it out of, into a disposable needle. I'm assuming that no one else is getting vaccine from that same tub, right? Or maybe they are. I don't know. Thimerosal was added to that to deal with the bacteria, so people were only injected with the vaccine, not with live bacteria that might cause an infection. However, thimerosal can break down in the body into mercury, which everyone knows is really dangerous. The phrase mad as a hatter is often attributed to the effects of mercury poisoning, and even a couple of drops of liquid mercury can contaminate the air in an entire room. In my junior high school class, some dumbass, definitely not me, accidentally broke a mercury thermometer, and we all had to be evacuated until the room could be cleaned. It's one of the most dangerous elements on the periodic table and is extremely harmful to humans. Yeah, kids used to play with it. Like science class back in the day, they'd just have mercury to look at a liquid metal. Unsurprisingly, I once again have a caveat for you. The mercury we think of as extremely dangerous is methylmercury, the type that occurs in nature. Thimerosal breaks that down into a synthetic compound called ethylmercury, which behaves a bit differently in our bodies. Rather than talk about half-lives and complex biological processes to explain the difference, here's a simple analogy for you. Ethyl alcohol is the stuff you drink when you and your friends want to have a night on the town. Methyl alcohol is the shit that makes you go blind, assuming it doesn't kill you. Though it's a bit of an oversimplification, you can think of the difference between ethylmercury and methylmercury in the same way. Not only is ethylmercury far less dangerous, but the amount contained in the vaccines was tiny. For decades, thimerosal was commonly used in vaccines until Wakefield came and fucked everything up. Mercury is known to cause neurological effects, so people began to claim that thimerosal was the cause of vaccine-induced autism. Wait, why? What's the link between? Is the link between mercury? Did I miss something? Methylmercury, vaccines. Oh, okay, so it can have neurological effects, but that doesn't mean autism. There was no evidence for this, but the CDC decided to take action anyway. In the 1990s, they told vaccine manufacturers to stop using thimerosal immediately. The end result wasn't actually vaccines that were safer, just vaccines that were more expensive and wasteful, as all vials now had to be single dose instead of multiple doses. But hey, no more worries about mercury in vaccines in the US. Yeah, sometimes it's just about pleasing the public so that they'll go and get their fucking vaccines. Another big point of contention was aluminium. This was added to vaccines to make them more effective in a way that certainly sounds scary and potentially irresponsible. The aluminium contained within vaccines is meant to cause, or at least simulate, tissue damage. This makes the immune system believe that the threat is bigger than it is, resulting in a stronger response and a more powerful, lasting immunity. The idea, that sounds great. That sounds really fucking clever. The idea of deliberately causing tissue damage doesn't sound great, even if that doesn't necessarily happen and may only be a simulation. Look, they're jabbing you with a needle. There's tissue damage. It's, you're doing the greater good here. But it has been deemed safe as the aluminium is only present at low levels. However, there are accusations that aluminium in vaccines can cause macrophagic myofasciitis. Macrophagic myofasciitis, or MMF, thankfully, is a relatively new condition, first described by French doctors in 1998. It was defined by lesions and microscopic levels of necrosis in muscle tissue that was biopsied from the deltoid muscles, the muscles commonly used for vaccines. These lesions contained aluminium and potentially persisted in the body for up to 8 years. As soon as MMF was discovered, there was the obvious link between aluminium in the vaccines and aluminium in the MMF lesions. But was this just another case of illusory correlation? Maybe, we don't really know. The amount of aluminium contained in vaccines is extremely small, less than a baby ingests from a single serving of breast milk or formula. Yeah, but it's being injected into the muscle or blood, which is a bit different. A case study from France found that those with MMF were more likely to have received vaccines containing aluminium, but the phrase more likely means that not everyone did. That means that even if aluminium in vaccines did increase the risk of MMF, it couldn't be the only cause. So, how dangerous is MMF? Well, the biggest danger is that one of the guys will either feel neglected or fall in love, with touching hips being a close second. I'm so fucking lost. There's a reference I don't get, Kevster. As for the medical condition, though, the biggest danger is fatigue. It's worth noting that a lot of people who had MMF previously suffered from malaria, a disease that causes Oh! I get it, Kevster! MMF, male, female. Yes, Kevster, I get it. It took me a minute. A disease that causes touching tips. I always think of Entourage. They call it the Devil's Threesome. So it's not clear that MMF and fatigue are actually related. In fact, despite having a very technical-sounding name, it's not even clear if MMF is a specific illness. According to the WHO, there is no conclusive evidence that MMF either is or isn't an actual illness. If it is, it certainly doesn't seem to have any harmful symptoms. In short, aluminium in vaccines, despite certainly involving some scary-sounding details, does not appear to present any meaningful risk. Again, you get less aluminium from a vaccine than you do in breast milk. And that brings us to formaldehyde, the final of these specific ingredients that cause concern. Much like thimerosal, this has been used in vaccines since the 1930s. Viruses are cultured and then formaldehyde is used to deactivate them, rendering them harmless so they can be used in vaccines. Most of the formaldehyde is then removed, but trace amounts can remain in the vaccines. Of course, the one thing most people know about formaldehyde is that it's used in embalming fluid. It's also highly toxic, so people don't generally consider formaldehyde as being compatible with life. Nah, it's the thing that gets pumped into people after they're dead. It's like, if someone said formaldehyde, you know where you do that thing where it's like, cup, and then you're like, glass, and you're like, formaldehyde, death. The average person could be forgiven for this assumption, as the importance of formaldehyde is well outside the scope of what would be covered in high school biology class. That said, your body produces formaldehyde naturally. It's an important part of metabolism, used for the synthesis of amino acids and DNA for new cells, and your body produces about 1.5 ounces of formaldehyde on a daily basis. Who knew? I mean, Kevin knew. Obviously, you shouldn't go and drink a bottle of the stuff, but the trace amounts found in a vaccine are absolutely safe. At any given time, your body will contain about 70 times more formaldehyde than is contained in a vaccine, so it's nowhere near dangerous levels. Another common concern is not that the vaccines are inherently dangerous on their own, but that children are being given too many vaccines in a short period of time. There's that Trump quote. Is it Trump who said, children are not horses? Or something like that. It's really bizarre. The fear is that this overloads their immune system, leading to negative outcomes such as autism. It shouldn't be a surprise that would be the end conclusion of the vaccine overload theory, though, as this was also presented by Wakefield. Well, yeah, because he was talking about MMR, measles, mumps, and rubella all at once. And as everyone knows, children are not horses. Of course, Wakefield didn't formally try to prove that children's immune systems were being overloaded with too many vaccines at once. That would involve, actual science. Instead, when pressured in an interview to explain why he believed that the measles vaccine contained in the MMR vaccine would cause autism, but it would be fine to give on its own, well, that was the best he could come up with. After all, it's not like he was going to say, because I want you to buy my vaccine instead. On the surface, this theory does sound plausible. The childhood vaccination schedule in the US today consists of 15 shots for 21 different diseases. Back in 1980, it was only 7 shots. 15 is more than 7, so obviously the viral load is greater, right? Well, actually no. Thanks to newer technologies like recombinant vaccines, the load on the immune system is actually 10 times less now than it was in the 1980s. I remember when I mentioned that one of the defining characteristics of smallpox is how big the actual virus is. Because of this, the entire modern vaccination schedule has less of an immunologic load than a single smallpox vaccine did. Wow. It's good we don't have that smallpox one anymore, because we got rid of it with vaccines. Awesome. It's also worth noting that kids are exposed to pathogens a lot. Yeah, I've got 2 kids. They get fucking germ factories, dude. Like a metric fuck ton of them. Your kid is going to be subjected to more germs from eating a handful of dirt or from putting their mouth on the corner of a table than they are from a few vaccines. Oh yes, and that's not even mentioning the trillions of bacteria that live in their bodies and on their skin. Given how many pathogens people come into contact with on a daily basis, if the viral load from a few vaccines was enough to overload your immune system, then we'd have died off as a species a long time ago. Yeah, we wouldn't have really made it very far as a species at all, to be honest. And that pretty much covers the reasonable concerns people have about vaccines. There are other theories like Bill Gates is putting GPS chips in vaccines to track us, but those are ludicrous. We don't need to address them. It's been said many times. We all have cell phones, and we're willingly letting ourselves be tracked constantly. There's no need for some secret nefarious plot to do the thing that we're voluntarily doing anyway. Yeah, it's not my joke, but there's that great joke that there's like a meeting at the CIA and they're talking about how to spy on people, and then it's like the something about how everyone's just spying on themselves and the CIA doesn't have to do any work anymore just because they spy on people's phones, which I'm sure is possible. I'm sure it could be listening to me right now if they wanted to. Hello, CIA. Of course, they're not going to be expending resources doing that because, as far as they know, I'm not a terrorist. I'm also not a terrorist, so that's nice. But for all the counterpoints I've discussed that attempt to disprove the specific concerns against vaccination, those opposed to vaccines have counterpoints as well. Counterpoints to the counterpoints. So, the main counterpoint against vaccines, and the one we've discussed the most thoroughly this far, is that they're dangerous. While I acknowledge that there are risks, such as allergic reactions, these risks are extremely rare and not nearly as life-threatening as the diseases themselves. Another claim, however, is that vaccines don't work at all. Oh, sure, smallpox and polio and measles are gone, but that's not because of vaccines. Your belief that they're because of vaccines is just another example of illusory correlation. It's true that the decline of these diseases began in the 1930s, which correlates with the creation of vaccines. But it also correlates with when running water and indoor plumbing became widely available. The argument here is that it was the improvement in overall hygiene and the removal of waste from the home instead of shitting in an outhouse that was the actual cure of these diseases. And you know what? It's kind of fair. Hygiene is certainly important for the prevention of disease, something that took the human race an embarrassingly long time to figure out. It's true. It's really true. It's so surprising how long it took us to figure out that we shouldn't be shitting in our kitchens. During outbreaks of Black Plague in the 1500s, renowned plague doctor and eventual charlatan Nostradamus, who was, I didn't know he was a plague doctor, was seen as a maverick for his radical theories that the sick should only be given clean water and that rotting, diseased corpses shouldn't be left on the sidewalk. And while Nostradamus' efforts treating the plague were highly successful, his ideas about cleanliness didn't fully catch on for like another 300 years. It's kind of a miracle that humans survived as long as we did, honestly. So, given the importance of hygiene in disease prevention, maybe linking vaccines with the eradication of deadly diseases was another example of correlation not equaling causation. Maybe it was indoor plumbing that saved all those lives. If only there was some way we could test this theory and figure out what was truly responsible. Oh my god, Kevin, let me guess. There's a way that we can test it using science. The bad news is that there's absolutely no ethical way to design an experiment to test something like that. Oh no! The good news is that we don't have to, because polio's back, baby! Okay, not in the US, but there's some very telling data coming out of Pakistan, one of the few areas of the world where wild polio hasn't yet been completely eradicated. I think there's two countries that still have polio? And like they're really working on getting rid of it because fuck polio. In 2010, 50% of the population of Pakistan had adequate access to clean water and indoor plumbing. By 2020, that number had increased to 68%. That's pretty amazing in 10 years, to be honest. According to the theory, this is the exact sort of rise in hygiene and waste removal that should correspond to a decrease in cases of infectious disease. Instead, we've seen a dramatic rise in case of wild polio. So, what could have happened around 2010 that would cause an increase in polio despite improved sanitation? Well, what happened is the United States wanted to kill Osama bin Laden. Oh, they're pressuring Pakistan, so they're cutting off health aid. And they were willing to do pretty much anything to make that happen. This led to what is referred to as the CIA's fake vaccination campaign in Pakistan. Bin Laden's, do you remember this? Bin Laden's sister died in Boston in 2010, so the CIA had her DNA on file. They decided to use the vaccination drive as a means to collect DNA samples from children and see if they could find a familial link to Bin Laden. So the CIA could prove that Bin Laden was hiding out in the village where they thought he was. As a quick side note, this is always referred to as a fake vaccination drive, but the kids were being given real vaccines. It was all being done as a ruse to collect their DNA and try to locate bin Laden, but at least they were actually giving the children vaccines instead of placebos or something. It was still incredibly fucked up, but it technically could have been worse. Could it have been worse if they'd just done nothing at all? I think so. Fuck bin Laden. I got no problem if they want to gather people's DNA in Pakistan to catch bin Laden. Fuck that guy. But these kids maybe wouldn't have otherwise had vaccines, so they'd be alive. So we're saving kids and catching a terrorist. Fuck yeah, America! Apparently the plan did work, but with disastrous consequences. The CIA's tactics were seen as morally reprehensible, and it created a lot of anti-vax sentiment in Pakistan. Oh yeah, I'm like, they never found out. I'm making a video about it, of course they found out. Why would I think they didn't find out? If I've seen this, you bet the Pakistani government has seen this. The Taliban together a fatwa against vaccination programs, and they began a propaganda campaign to keep people from getting vaccinated. Oh no, this backfired terribly. The propaganda probably wasn't even necessary, as people were already outraged, but the Taliban also spread lies, such as that vaccines contained pork. What's in there? Well, I got a little polio shot and some bacon. Anyone attempting to distribute vaccines was seen as a foreign spy, and since 2012, at least 95 healthcare workers are believed to have been killed for administering polio vaccines. I would be in big trouble. I was like, this is such a great idea, CIA, well done. And I'm exactly the sort of person who'd be like, oh shit, didn't foresee this. Vaccination numbers in Pakistan plummeted, and we've seen a corresponding rise in cases of wild polio. This is despite the dramatic increase in sanitation over the same period, which directly contradicts the claim that it was sanitation rather than vaccines that caused these diseases to die off in the first place. This isn't just an over-there problem either. Measles was officially declared eradicated in the US in the year 2000, yet in recent years, we've seen a resurgence of outbreaks, primarily in unvaccinated communities. About a week ago at the time of writing, the US experienced its first death from measles in a decade, when an unvaccinated child from Texas died from the disease. That is extremely sad, and those parents should be in big trouble. If they've got other kids, they should be taken away from them. Just 9 hours ago at the time of writing, an unvaccinated adult from New Mexico also died from measles. Well, you're an adult, you're making your own decisions, you be you. If you want to not get a vaccine and then you die of a disease, not going to have a terribly large amount of sympathy for you. Unless you want to argue that people in Texas and New Mexico don't bathe and are still shitting in outhouses, it's hard to claim that these deaths are related to sanitation rather than a lack of vaccination. And seeing as there are currently outbreaks of measles across at least 6 states right now, it wouldn't be surprising if there are even more deaths by the time this episode airs. That's depressing. Another big counterpoint we've discussed a lot already is that vaccines cause autism, but I do need to address that many people making this claim have brought the numbers to prove it. Kids are being given twice as many different vaccines today as they were in the 1980s, and the number of people diagnosed with autism has spiked dramatically. And yes, individually, those are both true statements. According to the CDC, 1 in 150 children born in 1992 was diagnosed with autism. This number increased to 1 in 36 for children born in 2012, and the graph of the data shows a consistent and definitive upward trajectory of autism cases. Isn't this going to be about diagnosis and improved diagnosis? Because, yeah, I feel so. While this data is undeniably accurate, does it mean that the incidence of autism is actually increasing, or is there another possibility? Diagnosis. I think the answer is diagnosis. To answer that, I want to tell you about the little kid from next door. I mean, he's 31 now, but he was friends with my sister back when they were 5 and I was 16, so to some extent, I'll always think of him as a little kid. Anyway, that boy grew up and joined the military. In fact, he became a Navy SEAL, a member of one of the most elite special forces in the world. A few years ago, he was out on a ship when some routine training exercises were going on. Things unfortunately went wrong and a helicopter being crewed by his friends crashed, killing them. Oh, that's sad. Since he was a SEAL and already happened to be there, he was then tasked with diving into the water to personally retrieve his friends' corpses. Oh, God. When his service contract was up, he unsurprisingly opted not to re-enlist and was given an honorary discharge with disability, what with the incredible trauma and all that. Now, what if this had happened in 1992? Do you think he'd have been given disability for PTSD? What about 1982? I mean, PTSD wasn't even an official diagnosis until 1980, when it was added the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or DSM. Yeah, they just used to call it shell shock. People were like, oh, he's a bit fucked up from war. It's not a disease. He's just fucked up. Give him a glass of scotch, he'll be fine. Coincidentally, that's the same year that autism was added to the DSM. Or I guess not so coincidentally, as a new edition of the DSM is only published every 12 to 14 years ago. So, yeah, I was going to say, a lot of stuff gets added to the DSM each go-around. But even though neither of those were an official diagnosis before 1980, that doesn't mean they didn't still exist. In World War I, it was called shell shock. There we go. And it was generally considered the soldier's own fault for being weak. Though some with shell shock were considered to be sick or wounded, this was hardly the default. Then it was World War II, where it was called combat fatigue, though that phrase also refers to combat stress reaction, which is basically an acute, temporary version of PTSD. By this point, it was recognized that these reactions were the result of the horrors of war rather than any personal failing, and there were even guidelines related to how long it was believed to take for combat fatigue to set in. So, PTSD is a thing that existed. It's nothing new. We just now have a better understanding and ways to diagnose it. Yes! And the same is true for autism. This isn't a new condition that magically appeared in 1980 when it became an official diagnosis, or even in 1911 when the term autism was first coined by German psychiatrist Eugen Bleuler. While an increase in diagnoses could indicate increased prevalence of the condition, it's far more likely to be the result of increased understanding and more reliable means of detection. The final counterpoint those opposed to vaccines use is that natural immunity is better than immunity from vaccines. And to that, I say, it's complicated. To start, how much immunity either will give a person is somewhat variable on an individual level. In general, though, most but not all vaccines provide stronger immunity than natural exposure does. Oh, I didn't know that. The two examples I can find where natural immunity is stronger are measles and chickenpox, though some of that research goes back to 1998 and there may be more recent research I'm unaware of. That said, there are workarounds for this. Natural immunity for chickenpox is stronger, but that's why children receive 2 doses of the vaccine. Indeed they do. I remember this. By giving 2 doses, it provides strong and lasting immunity to the virus. Yeah, we just got it done because a friend of ours' kid had just had terrible chickenpox. Like, really? And I was like, well, I can just pay, them to jab them up and not have to worry about this, and that was a really good decision, in my opinion. Breakthrough cases do occur, but they are extremely rare. People receive 2 doses of the MMR vaccine for this same reason as well, and that's certainly a lot safer than taking your chances with the wild measles virus, which has a mortality rate of up to 3 in every 1,000. That doesn't sound like a lot, but since most common adverse reaction to a vaccine was an allergy to gelatin affecting 1 in every 2 million people, the vaccine is still over 1,000 times safer. Yeah, and one is you've got measles, and the other is you've got an allergic reaction. I'd rather have an allergic reaction in a doctor's office or hospital than get the measles. And that relative risk is an important thing to factor in, but one that's easily overlooked. When a person considers any medical treatment, not just vaccines, they have a tendency to hyperfixate on potential side effects. If you choose to do something and have a negative outcome as a result, that feels much worse than if you had a negative result from doing nothing. Essentially, people calculate the risks of side effects and decide whether to find that risk acceptable or not, but they aren't actually comparing it to anything. There's an example I use all the time when people mention being worried about the side effects of drugs like antidepressants. They'll mention all those rare but possible side effects of the drug and how they're not sure if they should take it, at which point I'll remind them that there are side effects to not taking the drug as well. In that instance, the side effects of not taking the drug is continuing to feel whatever they were feeling before it made them seek help in the first place. In the case of vaccines, the side effect of not taking them is dying from fucking measles or polio in 2025. Yeah, and I know it seems like those two things are not that similar, but lots of people kill themselves. And antidepressants are really good at stopping that. Health organizations like the CDC take these things into account as well. When the oral polio vaccine was introduced, the odds of vaccine-associated paralytic poliomyelitis were just 1 in 2.3 million. Compared to the risks of wild polio, that was pretty bloody good. But once wild polio was eliminated in the US, the risk was no longer acceptable. In that specific instance, it shouldn't have been acceptable in the first place, since the inactivated vaccine was even safer, but the Cutter incident really screwed up those calculations. However, there was another instance where a vaccine was pulled after being deemed unsafe. In 1998, RotaShield became the first vaccine approved against the rotavirus. If you're unfamiliar with rotavirus, and hopefully you are, I am, I've vaguely heard of it. It's a disease that makes you vomit and diarrhea everywhere until, in some cases, you die of dehydration. Those with severe symptoms can't even rehydrate on their own, as they just vomit everything back up and need intravenous fluids to weather the symptoms. Yeah, this is why, getting rotavirus in a country where there's not reliable healthcare would be a disaster and potentially kill you. Whereas if you get rotavirus, if I got rotavirus, I'd go to the hospital, they'd hook me up to an IV and give me some drugs, and I'd be like, good times. I'd probably be shitting everywhere, so it wouldn't be great times, but at least I'm not dying. In short, it's an extremely unpleasant disease and kills over 600,000 children worldwide each year. RotaShield seemed like a godsend until it was discovered that RotaShield had the potential to cause intussusception. This is a blocking of the intestines that can be fatal if not treated. It was only 1 or 2 cases of intussusception in every 10,000 vaccines, but if the odds of experiencing a dangerous side effect are more likely than your odds of being hit by lightning, that's generally a really bad thing. For those curious, the odds of being hit by lightning at some point in your life are about 1 in 15,000. That seems really low. Just to be clear, this wasn't something that the makers of RotaShield were hiding either. There had been cases of intussusception in their trial, but 1 in 2,000 kids suffers from intussusception in the first year anyway. Researchers noticed the number was slightly, but not alarmingly higher than that during the trials, and investigated to see if they could find any link, but they failed to do so. Despite not being able to prove a link, they still listed intussusception as a possible side effect of the vaccine as a precaution. So far, RotaShield seem to be doing everything that they should be doing. This seems like it could be quite unfortunate. A year after it hit the market, RotaShield was pulled because of the side effect. The polio vaccine took longer to be pulled than it should due to extenuating circumstances, but this time they showed the vaccine manufacturers really weren't going to screw around and release dangerous products. I'm sure part of that was public pressure as well, but either way, the vaccine was pulled from the market because the CDC wants everyone to be able to have confidence in the safety of vaccines. Unfortunately, this was the wrong call. As it turns out, rotavirus can also cause intussusception. Not only that, but the wild virus caused it at the same rate as the vaccine did. Basically, if a person was likely to come into contact with rotavirus, then intussusception was equally likely to happen, regardless of whether or not a person got the vaccine. The difference being that those who got the vaccine didn't have to worry about vomiting to death. It was 7 years before the next rotavirus vaccine was developed, and about 2,000 children die every day from 600,000 a year. That's so many. From a parental disease until the next vaccine came. So if you think that the CDC or the drug companies are deliberately selling unsafe vaccines, just know exactly how many children they're willing to let die to make you feel better about the safety of vaccines. Final thoughts. So, are vaccines really dangerous? No. Of course they're not. Despite all fears and claims, there is absolutely no credible evidence they're harmful in any way. And yes, it is possible in rare instances to have an adverse reaction to one of the ingredients. But this is true of literally anything. You are far more likely to have an adverse reaction to a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, a tall glass of milk, or a big bowl of gluten than you are to a vaccine. Not only are vaccines safe, but we just discussed how the people behind them are willing to make terrible decisions to eliminate any doubts about their safety. And if you need any proof of that, just look around you. Do you see anyone with smallpox, polio, mumps, measles, rubella, diphtheria, or any of these other horrible diseases? I think a big part of the problem, aside from all the lies and misinformation started by Andrew Wakefield as well as his greed, is that you actually don't see anyone with these things. Most of you watching this live in a developed nation where vaccines for these illnesses are standard, and you're young enough where you likely have never met a single person who caught one of the diseases I mentioned. As a result, we don't fully appreciate how deadly, contagious, and horrifying these viruses can be. We're being told to get vaccinated against some long-forgotten threat, so it becomes easier to question whether these precautions are even necessary. You can say to yourself, well, I'm not vaccinated and I never caught this disease, so how contagious can it really be? And if it's just you, then you can get away with it because you're being protected by herd immunity from everyone else getting vaccinated, the same way that immunocompromised people who literally can't get vaccinated are protected. But if more people stop vaccinating, that herd immunity goes away and suddenly outbreaks start up again, as we are currently seeing. This is why it's so important for vaccines to be mandatory. It's not just about your personal health, it's about protecting others as well. I know Americans love choices and freedom. This is written by Kevin. It's not my statement. I won't speak on Americans. But nobody chose to be born with an autoimmune disease. Vaccine mandates aren't about stripping you of your freedom. They're about ensuring that people who are medically unable to receive vaccines still have a chance at life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Nobody should be expected to die for your freedom if you won't get a harmless shot for theirs. Besides, vaccine mandates are quintessentially American, something deeply rooted in our nation's history. If George Washington hadn't issued a vaccine mandate in 1777, there wouldn't even be a United States today. And I guess the French helped as well too. Bloody French. Honestly though, short of watching all of their friends die from previously eradicated diseases, I don't know what will convince some people that vaccines are safe and effective. I'm not even sure that would do the trick. I tried to be as fair as I can, by including all the facts that aren't convenient for vaccine advocates, in the hopes that anyone watching this who is anti-vax or vaccine hesitant might make it to the end of the video. If so, I hope I've been able to convince you the vaccines really are safe, or at least have been able to move the needle in that direction a little. That said, just remember, vaccines do not cause autism. Autism causes vaccines. We can't say with absolute certainty if people in the past were autistic, as the diagnosis didn't exist yet, but it is widely believed that some of the greatest scientific minds of all time, like Isaac Newton and Albert Einstein, were on the spectrum. Think about it. Isaac Newton saw an apple fall off a tree and wondered, why do apples always fall down? Why don't they ever fall up or sideways? If that isn't the most autistic thought process you've ever heard, I don't know what is. Fair play, Kevster. Okay, after running that last line by some of my autistic friends, they've informed me that the actual most autistic process is, I think you're cool, so now I'm going to tell you 3 hours of facts I know about trains. The point still stands, though. There's a lot of research showing that scientists are far more likely to have autism than the general population, including a paper by British psychologist and cousin of Ali G, Sir Simon Baron-Cohen. Wait, Sacha Baron Cohen has a cousin who's a knight, Sir Simon Baron-Cohen. Wow, okay. I'm not making any specific claims or speculation about whether or not Hilleman, Salk, or other creators of vaccines may have been autistic. All I'm saying is that research shows science and innovation is more likely to come from people who are. In fact, maybe that should be the takeaway from today's episode. If you still think vaccines cause autism, despite a total and complete lack of evidence, that's even more reason to vaccinate your children. Autism doesn't guarantee high intelligence, but the intellectually gifted are more likely to be autistic. So that should be reason enough to let your child get vaccinated. Sure, they might act a little weird sometimes, but Einstein refused to wear socks and he owned and frequently used a sailboat despite not knowing how to swim. A few quirky traits that seem like a trade-off for a Nobel Prize. And that's the end of today's episode. Thanks for being here.